Anne. Tonight we sit with a story that most people walk past on their way to the louder parts of the legend. The boy who lived, the Dark Lord, the last spell in the Great Hall. All of that is told and retold. What gets left in the dark is the house that wore green and silver, and what became of it once the shouting stopped and the smoke thinned, and the castle had to decide what kind of place it wanted to be. So that is where we are going. We are going to follow Slytherin after the war. It is a heavy subject if you let it be, full of grief and suspicion and slow forgiveness. And I will keep my voice low and even the whole way through, so you can let the words blur at the edges and slip off to sleep whenever you are ready. There is no test at the end. You do not have to remember any of it. You only have to rest. Anne. Before we go down into the dungeons, let me say thank you to the people who keep coming back, night after night, letting these stories carry you off. If you are drifting with us again, leave a comment and tell me how many nights in a row you have been here. And if this is your first time, just write night 1, so I know you found your way in. Now settle into whatever is soft and warm around you, and let us begin. The sun came up over the Forbidden Forest on the morning of the 2nd of May, 1998. It came up the way it always had, indifferent to everything that had happened in the dark, and the light fell across a castle that no longer looked like itself. Anne. There were holes in the walls where there had never been holes. There was rubble on the stairs. The grass on the lawns had been churned to mud and worse, and in the great hall the long tables had been pushed aside so the dead could be laid out in rows beneath the enchanted ceiling, which had gone pale and clear, showing a soft and ordinary dawn. Inside that hall, people moved slowly. They held each other. Anne. They knelt by the bodies of friends and brothers and teachers and tried to understand that the fighting was actually over, that there would be no fresh wave of curses through the broken doors, that the thing they had been bracing against for years had finally broken instead. And somewhere below all of that, beneath the stone floors, beneath the levels where the noise of mourning could not quite reach, the Slytherin common room sat empty in the green underwater light that came through its windows from the depths of the lake. That emptiness matters. To understand what happened to Slytherin after the war, you have to start with the strange and lonely fact of how the night of the battle began for them. When the castle prepared to fight, when Professor McGonagall stood in the Great Hall and ordered the students into their houses, so the youngest could be evacuated and the oldest could choose whether to stay, one house was treated differently from all the rest. Pansy Parkinson, a Slytherin girl, had stood up and pointed at Harry Potter and cried out that someone should just grab him and hand him over to the Dark Lord and end it. She was frightened. A great many people in that hall were frightened, but she said it out loud, and in the silence that followed, the students of Gryffindor and Ravenclaw and Hufflepuff all rose to their feet at once, wands ready, and turned toward the Slytherin table. McGonagall settled it quickly. She had the Slytherin students led out of the hall first, marched up and away from the fighting, out through the castle and off the grounds. The official reason was evacuation, the same as for the younger children of every house. But everyone in that hall understood the other meaning underneath the order. Slytherin had been moved out of the way because nobody trusted what Slytherin would do if it stayed. So, when the curses started flying, when the giants came, and the spiders poured out of the trees, and the defenders held the bridges and the courtyards through the long hours of the night, the House of the Serpent was not there. Its banners hung in an empty room. Its students were scattered, sent home or sheltered or hiding, while the other 3 houses bled for the castle. That is the image the wizarding world carried out of the battle and held on to for years afterward. The brave houses stayed, the snakes ran. It was not the whole truth, and we will come back to that, because the whole truth was kinder and more complicated than the story people wanted to tell. But a story does not have to be true to do damage. It only has to be simple and easy to repeat and satisfying to the people repeating it. And in the weeks and months after the war, as the wizarding world tried to sort the good from the guilty, that simple story sat over the whole of Slytherin House like a low ceiling, pressing down on every child who had ever been sorted there. Picture the morning from the inside of that house. The handful of Slytherins who had defied the order, who had slipped back or refused to leave or returned with the reinforcements that came in the final hours, woke to a castle that looked at them sideways. The far larger number who had been marched out woke at home, or in some borrowed bed, to the news that it was finished, that the Dark Lord was dead, and that they were now on the wrong side of a line that had been drawn while they were absent. There had been no good choice available to a 16-year-old in green that night. Stay and be suspected. Leave and be branded a coward. Fight for a cause your family had sworn to, or fight against everyone you had grown up beside. The war had handed Slytherin a set of doors that all opened onto the same cold room. One person came back, though. One person in green chose the castle when he did not have to, and his choice would shape the whole long aftermath of the house more than almost anyone else's. Horace Slughorn, the potions master, the head of Slytherin, had spent most of his life being very good at avoiding exactly this kind of moment. Anne. He collected promising students the way other men collect wine, kept up his contacts, stayed comfortable, and stepped carefully around anything that might cost him. When the dark times came, he had gone into hiding rather than be recruited, drifting from one empty muggle house to the next, leaving a trail of dead spiders in the front rooms to make the places look long abandoned. He was not a brave man by instinct. He knew it about himself and made no great show otherwise. And yet, on the night of the battle, after he had helped lead the Slytherin students out, Horace Slughorn turned around and came back. He returned at the head of the reinforcements in the final hours, with the shopkeepers and parents and former students of Hogsmeade, with his own old contacts, and he fought. He duelled in the Great Hall against the people he had spent years politely avoiding. For a man whose entire personality had been built around staying out of trouble, it was the single bravest thing he ever did, and it was done in the colours of the house that everyone else had already written off. That fact would matter enormously in the years to come, though almost nobody noticed it at the time, because when people said Slytherin ran, they were forgetting that Slytherin's own head of house had run straight back into the worst of it. The house was not one thing, it never had been. It contained a frightened girl who said the unforgivable thing out loud, and it contained an old teacher who conquered a lifetime of self-interest in a single night, and it contained every shade of person in between, and the war had given all of them the same banner and the same suspicion, regardless of what any of them had actually done. Let us go back down into the dungeons in those first quiet days, because the common room itself has a story. Anne. While the upper floors of the castle filled with rescue workers and grieving families and ministry officials, the dungeons stayed dim and undisturbed. The Slytherin common room is a long, low room under the lake, its walls of rough stone hung with tapestries, its windows looking out into the green water, where, on a lucky night, the pale shape of a merperson or the slow drift of the giant squid might pass by. There were the high-backed chairs, the carved mantelpiece, the silver lamps, all of it sitting in the underwater dark, waiting for students who had been sent away and were not sure they would be allowed to return. For a few days the room belonged to no one. House elves came and went, setting the fires out of old habit, dusting furniture that no one would sit in. The portraits on the walls, the long line of former Slytherins painted in oils, and watching the room with painted eyes, talked among themselves about the battle they had heard raging far above them, and about what would become of the house they had, each, in their own century, called home. Some of those portraits were of people whose names would have frightened you. Some were of people you would have liked very much. Anne. They had all been Slytherins, and now they waited together to learn whether the world above still had a place for their house at all. There was a real question in those early days about whether Slytherin would even continue. Not formally. No one in the ministry was going to abolish a Hogwarts house by decree, and McGonagall, who would soon be headmistress, would never have allowed it. But there was a feeling in the air, a sense that the house of Salazar Slytherin had finally produced one Dark Lord too many, that perhaps the cleanest thing would be to let it wither, to stop sorting children into it, to let the green and silver fade out of the castle the way an old grudge fades when the last person carrying it dies. You could feel that wish in the way people spoke. Good riddance, some of them said, to that nest of vipers. Let it close. It did not close. And the reasons it did not close are the spine of this whole story. So hold on to the question as we go. Why did Slytherin survive when so many people wanted it gone? The answer has to do with Slughorn, and with McGonagall, and with a handful of children who refused to apologize for the color of their robes, and with the slow, grudging, decades-long discovery that ambition and cunning are not the same thing as cruelty, and never were, Anne. Before we follow the house up out of those first dark days, let me hold on the image of the empty common room a moment longer, because there is a peace in it that is worth sitting in. The green light moving on the stone, the fire that the elves keep lighting for no one, the squid passing slow and enormous beyond the glass. A room built for 1,000 years of children, sitting patient and untroubled while the world above decides its fate. Rooms outlast the arguments about them. The stone does not care who is ashamed of it. It simply keeps the cold out and the warmth in, and waits for the next set of footsteps on the stairs. Now, let us follow the people, because a house is only stone until you put the lives back into it. Anne. Start with Pansy Parkinson, since she was the one who spoke the words that hung over everyone else. It is easy to make her the villain of that night, the girl who tried to sell the hero to save her own skin. People did make her that, for years. Her name became a small piece of shorthand, a thing you called someone who chose comfort over courage. But she was 17 years old, in a hall full of corpses to be, with a monster's voice still echoing in her ears, promising that nobody else had to die if they simply handed over one boy. Fear does ugly things to the young, and it had done an ugly thing to her, out loud, in front of everyone, at the worst possible moment. What happened to her afterward is the kind of thing the loud version of the story never bothers to record. Anne. She finished growing up under the weight of that single sentence. She had wanted, before the war, the ordinary things a girl of her background wanted: a good marriage, a comfortable life, a place near the center of pure-blood society. Anne. The war did not so much take those things from her as rearrange the ground beneath them, so that the center she had been aiming for no longer existed, and the society she had been raised inside was now suspect and diminished. She married, eventually. She lived a small and private life, and kept her head down, and gave the world no further reason to talk about her. Some people who knew her later said she had grown gentler with age, that the loud, frightened girl had become a careful and watchful woman who never again said the first thing that came into her head. Others said she stayed exactly as she had always been, and merely learned to hide it. Both can be true of a person at once. People are rarely improved by shame, but they are often quieted by it. And a quieted person can pass for a changed one if you do not look too hard. The point of Pansy, for our story, is not whether she deserved forgiveness. The point is that one frightened sentence from one 17-year-old was allowed to stand in for an entire house. Anne. When the wizarding world wanted a face for the idea that Slytherins were cowards and traitors, hers was the face that floated up. It was unfair in the specific way that all collective blame is unfair. Anne. It took the worst moment of the most frightened person and stretched it like a sheet over 1,000 other people who had said and done nothing of the kind. Against that one frightened sentence set the family that became the strange, central case of the whole aftermath, the Malfoys. If you want to understand how the war ended for Slytherin, you have to understand what happened in the last hour of the battle with Narcissa Malfoy, because it changed everything for her family and, through them, for the way the new ministry would think about guilt and mercy. Anne. By the time Voldemort walked out of the Forbidden Forest believing he had killed Harry Potter, the Malfoys were a broken family wearing the costume of a powerful one. Lucius had spent the previous year as a prisoner in his own home, stripped of his wand, humiliated daily. The manor turned into the Dark Lord's headquarters and torture chamber. Whatever pride had carried him into Voldemort's service had long since been beaten out of him. He had watched his cause curdle into terror that did not even spare his own household. Narcissa had spent that same year doing the one thing the war had not managed to take from her, which was being a mother, frightened past all caring about blood purity or Dark Lords or the winning side, frightened only for her son. So, when Voldemort sent Narcissa to check whether the boy on the ground in the forest was truly dead, and she knelt over him and felt, against everything, that his heart was still beating, she made a calculation that had nothing to do with any war. She leaned close and asked him one question, in a whisper meant for him alone. Was Draco alive inside the castle? And when Harry breathed the smallest yes against her, Narcissa Malfoy stood up, turned to the most dangerous wizard who had ever lived and told him that the boy was dead. It was a lie that ended the war, because Harry, alive and pretending to be dead, was carried back to the castle and rose and finished it. Narcissa did not do it for the light. She did not do it out of any late-blooming nobility. She did it because a living Harry Potter walking into Hogwarts was the only road she could see that led back to her son. She betrayed the darkest wizard of the age out of plain animal love for her child, and in doing so she handed the entire war to the other side. The Malfoys did not stay for the end. In chaos of the final battle, Lucius and Narcissa pushed through the crowds in the Great Hall, looking only for Draco, found him, and held him, and when it was over the three of them sat together apart from everyone else, not celebrating, not mourning the right people, simply clinging to one another, unsure whether they had survived into a world that would let them keep living. They were not embraced. They were not thanked. Anne. They sat in the cold space that the rest of the hall left around them, a family that had been on the wrong side and knew it, kept alive by one mother's single act of treason against her own cause. That act is what stood between the Malfoys and Azkaban when the trials came, and the trials came for a great many people. Anne. This brings us to the New Order, and to the man who would have to decide what justice meant after a war that had soaked half the wizarding establishment in collaboration. In the immediate aftermath, the Ministry of Magic was a ruin of its own kind. It had been infiltrated, then openly captured, then run as an instrument of terror, registering Muggleborns, staging show trials, sending the innocent to Azkaban. The people who had run it under Voldemort were not all card-carrying Death Eaters in masks. Many of them were ordinary officials who had simply kept their jobs, signed the papers, looked away, told themselves they were surviving rather than serving. When the war ended, the question of what to do with all of them was enormous and genuinely hard. Kingsley Shacklebolt took the job of sorting it out. A former Auror, a member of the Order of the Phoenix, a tall and calm and very steady man. He was made the temporary Minister for Magic in the days after the battle, and then confirmed in the role. Almost everyone agreed he was the right choice, which after the chaos of the previous regimes was itself a small miracle. And Kingsley made a decision early that shaped the entire aftermath of the war for Slytherin and for everyone else. He decided that the new ministry would not become a mirror of the old one. Anne, there would be trials, real ones, with evidence and testimony and the chance for the accused to speak. Anne, there would be no sweeping roundups, no punishing of people for their names or their houses or their families. Guilt would have to be shown, not assumed. That principle sounds obvious now. It was not obvious then. The temptation after a war like that one is to grab everyone who wore the wrong color and throw them into the sea, and there were plenty of voices in the wizarding world urging exactly that. Round up the Slytherins, round up the pure-blood families, make them pay. Kingsley held the line against it, and in doing so, he gave Slytherin the one thing it most needed to survive, which was the chance to be judged as individuals rather than as a single guilty mass. The trials themselves filled the months after the war. Some of them were straightforward. The Death Eaters, who had been captured in the act. The ones with the dark mark on their arms and blood on their hands. The killers and torturers went to Azkaban, and few mourned them. Others were harder. Anne. There were the officials who had collaborated under duress. The ones who could honestly say they had a wand at their family's throat. There were the children of Death Eaters, who had grown up steeped in a poison they had never chosen. Anne. There were people who had done one terrible thing and 100 ordinary ones, and the Wizengamot had to weigh all of it. Harry Potter testified at some of those trials. Anne. This is one of the quietest and most important facts of the whole aftermath, and it tells you something about how the war actually ended for Slytherin. The young man who had every reason to hate the family that had spent years tormenting him stood up in front of the Wizengamot and spoke for the Malfoys. He testified on behalf of Narcissa, telling the court what she had done in the forest, that her lie had made the victory possible. He spoke for Draco as well, the boy who had been ordered to murder Dumbledore and had stood on the tower unable to do it, the boy who had recognized him in the manor and refused to give him up. Harry did not pretend the Malfoys were good people. Anne. He simply told the truth about the specific things they had done at the end, and the truth was enough to keep them out of prison. So the Malfoys walked free. Lucius lost his standing, his influence at the ministry, much of the easy power his money had always bought him. The family name, once spoken with deference in the right drawing rooms, now carried a permanent stain. But they kept their freedom, and they kept the manor, and they kept each other. And for Narcissa, who had betrayed a dark lord to keep her son, that was the whole of what she had ever wanted. It is worth sitting with how strange and how merciful that outcome was. The most prominent Slytherin family of the age, a family woven into Voldemort's inner circle across 2 wars, came out the other side, not destroyed but diminished, not imprisoned but shamed, alive and together, and free to try to become something other than what they had been. That mercy was not popular. Anne. There were many who thought the Malfoys had bought their way out, or talked their way out, or gotten lucky in a way no one of lesser blood ever would. Some of that was true. Money and the right testimony do open doors that stay shut for the poor. But the deeper thing saved them was Kingsley's principle, that you judge the deed and not the name. And the Malfoys had, at the very end, done deeds that pointed toward mercy. Hold that principle in mind, because it is the same principle that, applied 1,000 times over the following years, slowly let the rest of Slytherin out from under the low ceiling of suspicion. One trial at a time, one testimony at a time. The wizarding world was forced to look at the people in green not as a guilty mass, but as a long list of separate human beings, each with their own choices to answer for. And most of them, it turned out, had no Death Eater crimes to answer for at all. They had simply been children in the wrong house at the wrong time. The Malfoys were the family everyone watched, Anne. They were never the whole of Slytherin, and the other families tell you more about what the house actually was, because most of them were never famous at all. Take the Greengrasses, an old pure-blood family who managed something rare in those years. They were what people in that world called sacred, an old line with no Muggle blood in living memory, exactly the sort of family Voldemort claimed to be fighting for. And yet, the Greengrasses stayed out of it. They did not take the mark. They did not throw in with the Death Eaters, Anne. They were neutral in the way that the very old and the very careful sometimes managed to be, keeping their heads down, declining to fight for either side, protecting their daughters and their money and their position by simply refusing to choose. After the war, this neutrality looked, depending on who was judging, either like cowardice or like wisdom. They had not fought against Voldemort. They had not fought for him either. They came out of the war intact and unstained, and their younger daughter, Astoria, would go on to matter enormously to this story, though we are not there yet. The Greengrasses prove a point that the loud version of the aftermath always missed. Pure blood did not mean Death Eater. There were entire ancient families who found the whole blood purity crusade distasteful, who thought Voldemort a vulgar fanatic dressing up murder as tradition, and who wanted nothing to do with him. Some of them were Slytherins to the bone, ambitious and proud and clannish, and they still wanted no part of his war, Anne. The house had always contained people like that, and after the war, those people became part of the argument that Slytherin and darkness were not the same thing. Then there were the families who chose the other way and paid for it. The Knots. The Elder Knot had been one of Voldemort's oldest followers, a man at the graveyard the night the Dark Lord returned, a true believer of long standing. He went to Azkaban, an old man dying slowly in a cold cell over the grey water, and his son Theodore was left to inherit a name that now meant prison and disgrace. Theodore had been a quiet, clever boy at school, more interested in books than in the swagger of the other, Death Eater children. The war left him with a ruined family fortune, a father in prison, and a surname that made shopkeepers go cold when he gave it. Whatever he had wanted out of life, he had to build it now from inside a house that had collapsed around him, and he had done nothing himself to deserve the rubble. That was a common shape after the war. The fathers chose darkness, and the children inherited the bill. The Crabs and the Goyles tell a harder, sadder version of the same story. These were not clever, calculating families. They were the muscle, the loyal, heavy hands, families who had followed the Malfoys and the Lestranges into Voldemort's service, less out of ideology than out of a kind of dull, brutal allegiance to where the power was. Vincent Crabbe died during the battle itself, killed by his own out-of-control cursed fire in the Room of Requirement. a boy who had reached for a magic too dark and too hungry to control and was eaten by it. His family came out of the war with a dead son and a wrecked name and nothing much to show for any of it. Gregory Goyle survived, but barely, a slow and frightened young man who had spent his whole school of life as a follower and now had no one left worth following. The war did not make the Goyles villains. It made them losers in the plainest sense. People who had bet everything on the strong horse and watched it fall, left with the debts and the grief and none of the glory they had been promised. Blaise Zabini went a different way entirely. His family was wealthy and beautiful and slippery, his mother famous for a long string of rich husbands who kept conveniently dying and leaving her their fortunes. Blaise himself had always held the war at a cool distance, too vain and too self-interested to die for anyone's cause. After the war, he did what people like him always do, which is land on his feet. He kept his money, he kept his looks, and he attached himself to whatever new arrangement of power seemed most comfortable, and he prospered in the mild and untroubled way of someone who never cared enough about anything to risk losing it. There is no triumph in his story and no tragedy. He is the reminder that some people simply slide through history's worst moments without being touched, because they were never really standing inside them in the first place. These families, taken together, give you the true shape of Slytherin after the war, and it is not the shape of the legend. The legend says snakes, traitors, dark wizards, a house of villains marched out of the castle while their betters fought. The reality was a scatter of frightened, grieving, ordinary families, most of whom had done nothing, some of whom had done everything. The children paying for the parents, the careful surviving and the committed punished, and the cowardly sliding through untouched. It was, in other words, a perfectly human cross-section of a defeated side. Every war produces one. The winners are remembered as heroes, and the losers are remembered as a single dark mass. And the truth, which is that the losing side was made of as many kinds of people as the winning one, gets buried under the convenience of the story. Let me pause on that idea before we go on, because it is the hinge of everything that follows. The losing side was made of as many kinds of people as the winning one. Hold that lightly as we move from the families to the wound they all shared. Now the reputation. Because the families are individual stories, but the house carried a single wound for years, and that wound was its name. In the first years after the war, to be known as a Slytherin in the wrong company was to be looked at with a particular kind of cold suspicion. It did not matter that you had been 11 years old when the sorting hat placed you there, Anne. It did not matter that you had spent the war doing your homework and missing your mother, Anne. The green and silver had become, in the public mind, the colours of the enemy, and a great many people who should have known better treated every Slytherin as a Death Eater who simply had not been caught yet. This showed up in small ways and large ones. A young Slytherin looking for work after leaving school would find doors that opened easily for a Gryffindor staying mysteriously shut for them. The ministry, even under Kingsley's fairer hand, was full of mid-level officials who would glance at an applicant's house and find a reason to pass them over. Shopkeepers in Diagon Alley remembered which families had been on the wrong side and let that memory bleed onto every customer in green robes. Old friendships, across house lines, never easy to begin with, frayed and snapped under the weight of who had stayed to fight and who had been marched away. The children had it worst, because children are honest about cruelty in a way adults learn to hide. In the years right after the war, a boy or girl sorted into Slytherin at the start of school might find themselves alone. At once, the other first years already taught at home that the snakes were bad, that Slytherins grew up to be Death Eaters, that you should not trust anyone in those colours. Imagine being 11, away from home for the first time, placed by a magic hat into a house whose name makes the rest of the room flinch. You did not choose it, you cannot change it, Anne. And from the first night you carry a weight that the 11-year-old in red beside you will never have to feel. That happened to a whole cohort of Slytherin children in the years after the war, and it is one of the quieter cruelties of how the wizarding world handled its peace. McGonagall, now headmistress, hated this and fought it in the small, steady ways available to a headmistress. She would not allow the house to be treated as a punishment within her own castle. She held the staff to fairness in points and discipline, and She made sure Slytherin still had its prefects and its Quidditch team and its place at the feasts, that its banner still hung in the Great Hall beside the other three, that no child in green was ever made to feel that the school itself had given up on them. Anne. She could not control what families taught their children at home, or what shopkeepers muttered in the alley, or what the Daily Prophet implied between its lines. But she could control her castle, and she defended Slytherin's place inside it with the same flinty stubbornness she brought to everything else. It mattered more than she ever said out loud. A house can survive the world's suspicion if its own school refuses to join in. Slughorn helped too, in his very different way. Where McGonagall defended Slytherin out of principle, Slughorn defended it out of love and a kind of wounded pride. This was his house. These were his snakes, his clever, ambitious children, and he was not going to stand by while the whole world decided they were rotten. He went back to teaching after the war, an old man now, heavier and slower, but he poured himself into his Slytherins with a tenderness that surprised people who only knew his reputation as a collector and a flatterer. Anne. He made it his business to know every student in green, to find the spark in each of them, to write the letters and make the introductions that opened the doors the rest of the world was trying to close. If a Slytherin could not get a fair hearing for a job, Slughorn knew someone who owed him a favour. If a bright Slytherin child was being frozen out, Slughorn made sure that child knew they had at least one adult in the castle who believed in them without reservation. He had spent his whole life building a web of contacts for his own comfort. After the war, he spent that web, generously and almost recklessly, on behalf of children who needed someone in their corner. It may have been the finest thing he ever did, finer even than coming back to fight, because it had no glory in it at all, and went on for years. Anne. To understand why the house was worth defending at all, you have to go back much further than the war, all the way back to the man whose name it carries, because the argument over Slytherin after the war was really an argument about Salazar Slytherin that had been waiting 1,000 years to be settled. The founders of Hogwarts are a story softened by time into something close to a nursery rhyme. 4 great witches and wizards, 1,000 years ago, building a castle in the Scottish Highlands to teach magic to the children who had it. Godric Gryffindor, bold and chivalrous; Helga Hufflepuff, kind and fair and patient; Rowena Ravenclaw, brilliant beyond measure; and Salazar Slytherin, cunning, ambitious, and, in the version everyone learns, the one who went wrong. The founder who wanted to keep magic pure. The founder who quarreled with the others and left in anger. The founder who built a hidden chamber and sealed a monster inside it to one day finish his work. Anne. By the time the story reaches a modern child, Salazar Slytherin has been reduced to the founder you are supposed to be a little afraid of. The bad apple, the seed of every dark wizard the school ever produced. The truth, as far as anyone can reconstruct it across 1,000 years of legend, is older and stranger and more tragic than that. Salazar Slytherin was not a cartoon. He was one of the 4 greatest magical minds of his age, a man who helped build the single most important institution in the history of British magic. He valued ambition, which is the desire to become more than you are. He valued cunning, which is the intelligence to find the path others cannot see. He valued resourcefulness and determination, and a certain refusal to accept the limits the world tried to place on you. These are not evil qualities. They are the qualities of nearly everyone who has ever changed anything. Strip the villainy out of the legend, and what you find at the bottom of Slytherin House is a set of values that any ambitious, clever, determined child might be proud to claim. Anne. The quarrel that broke the founders apart was real, and it was about something that has never stopped mattering. In an age when ordinary people feared and hunted those with magic, when witches were burned and wizards driven into hiding, Salazar came to believe that the school should teach only children from established magical families, that the Muggle-born were a danger, a leak, through which the secret of magic might escape into a hostile world. He was wrong. We can say that plainly now, because we have 1,000 years of evidence that Muggle-born witches and wizards are exactly as gifted and exactly as loyal as anyone else, and because we have watched where the logic of blood purity leads when it is followed to its end. But Salazar's error was born out of fear in a genuinely dangerous time, not out of nothing. He looked at a world that wanted his kind dead and concluded, wrongly and disastrously, that safety lay in keeping the circle small and the bloodlines closed. It is the oldest mistake in the world, the mistake of meeting fear with a wall, and he made it with the full force of a great mind behind it, which is what made it so durable and so poisonous in the centuries that followed. When the other three founders refused him, Salazar left. And here the legend turns into the thing that haunted the house for 1,000 years. Before he went, the story says, he built a hidden chamber deep beneath the castle and placed inside it a basilisk, a serpent of monstrous size whose gaze brings death, to be loosed one day by his true heir to purge the school of the students he believed did not belong. The Chamber of Secrets. It sat under the school for 1,000 years, a buried threat with Salazar's name on it, opened twice in recorded history, the second time by a boy named Tom Riddle, who would grow into Lord Voldemort, and who was, in fact, the last living descendant of Salazar Slytherin's line. That is, the inheritance the house was carrying when the war ended. Not just a bad reputation, but a literal monster in the basement, and a founder who had built it, Anne. You can see why people wanted to be done with the whole thing. If the deepest root of your house is a chamber full of death, sealed by a man who hated half the children in the school, what exactly is there to defend? But here is the turn. And it is the turn that the years after the war slowly forced upon everyone willing to think honestly. The crimes belong to specific people. The values belong to the house. Salazar, Slytherin's prejudice was his own, a personal failure that he carried out of the school with him and sealed in stone. Tom Riddle's evil was Tom Riddle's. The choice of one extraordinary and damaged boy to become a monster. Neither of them is the same thing as ambition. Neither is the same thing as cunning or determination or the refusal to accept your given place. 1,000 years of frightened storytelling had tangled the founder's prejudice together with the founder's virtues until people could no longer tell them apart, until a clever-driven, ambitious 11-year-old got sorted into green and was treated as though the hat had detected a future Death Eater rather than a future healer, or minister, or inventor, or simply a good person who happened to want very much to succeed. Untangling those two things, the prejudice from the virtues, was the central work of Slytherin's recovery after the war. It did not happen through any grand proclamation. There was no day on which the wizarding world announced that it had reconsidered the House of the Serpent. It happened slowly, through 10,000 small encounters, as Slytherins kept turning out, year after year, to be people. A Slytherin healer who saved your mother's life. A Slytherin who fought for better treatment of house elves. A Slytherin shopkeeper who was simply honest and kind. A Slytherin teacher you trusted. Each of these was a small contradiction of the legend. And the legend, like all legends, could survive a few contradictions but not an endless supply of them. Drop by drop, the new generations of Slytherins wore the old story down, until being sorted into green meant, once again, that you were ambitious and clever and determined, and nothing more sinister than that. While that long argument played out in the wider world, the house itself had to be physically and practically rebuilt, and that work fell mostly to Slughorn and to the castle's own deep patience. The dungeons had come through the battle better than the upper floors, being made of older and heavier stone and lying below the worst of the fighting. The common room under the lake needed little more than dusting and the relighting of its fires. But a house is not a room. A house is a continuity, a chain of students passing the same traditions down the years, and the war had nearly broken that chain. The older students, who would normally have mentored the younger ones, had been scattered or shamed, or were sitting in the cold space the world had left around the families that lost. The incoming first years were arriving into a house that the rest of the school had been taught to despise. Someone had to hold the chain together across the break, and that someone was Slughorn, with McGonagall's full backing from the headmistress's office above. He brought back the small rituals that make a house feel like a home rather than a label. The welcome of the new first years on their first night, gathered in the green light of the common room and told, plainly, that they belonged here, that their house had a long and proud history, that the worst chapter of that history did not define them. The encouragement of the Quidditch team, which gave the house something to cheer for, that had nothing to do with blood or war. And The slow rebuilding of the connections between older and younger students, so that an 11-year-old in green had someone of 15 to look up to and learn from. None of this was dramatic. All of it was necessary. Anne. A house survives in its boring continuities, in the fact that someone keeps lighting the fire and welcoming the children, and telling them they are not the worst thing said about them. Slughorn did not stay forever. Anne. He was old when he came back to fight, and he was older still by the time the house had steadied. And, after a few years of overseeing its recovery, he retired again, this time for good, back to his comfortable rooms and his crystallized pineapple, and his long correspondence with the famous people he had taught. He left Slytherin in better shape than he had found it, which, for a man who had spent most of his life avoiding responsibility, was a quiet kind of redemption. The students who came up through the house in his final years remembered him fondly. An old wizard who had believed in them when the world did not, and that memory became part of the house's idea of itself. Slytherin had been defended. Someone had stood in the doorway and refused to let the house be thrown away. The children, who grew up knowing that, grew up a little prouder and a little less ashamed. After Slughorn, the headmistress chose the next head of Slytherin carefully, knowing how much the choice would matter to a house still healing. The new head was not a famous name, not a war hero or a public figure, but a steady and fair-minded teacher who understood that the most important thing they could give their students was the ordinary experience of being trusted. Anne, a Slytherin child under that new head, was held to the same standards as anyone else, neither indulged because the house had suffered, nor punished because of what the house had once produced. That ordinariness was a gift. There is nothing a child wants more, after years of being treated as a symbol, than to be treated as a child. The slow normalization of Slytherin happened as much in those undramatic classroom hours as it did in any grand reconsideration of Salazar's legacy. The generation that mattered most to the house's recovery was the one that had been too young to fight. The children who started at Hogwarts in the years right after the war had no war record of their own, good or bad. Anne. They had not been marched out of the Great Hall. They had not said a frightened thing in front of the school. Anne. They arrived clean, carrying only the inherited weight of the name, and they were the ones who got to write the next chapter of what Slytherin meant. Anne. Some of them came from families that had been on the wrong side, and they grew up determined to be nothing like their fathers. Some came from families that had stayed neutral, and they grew up free of the whole quarrel. Anne. A few were Muggle-born or half-blood children who, in a delicious irony that Salazar Slytherin would have hated, were sorted into his house because they had exactly the ambition and cunning the hat looked for, and who proved by their simple presence that the house had never really belonged to the blood purists at all. That last point deserves its own moment, because it is the deepest answer to the question of what Slytherin became after the war. Anne. The blood purists had always claimed Slytherin as their own. They pointed to Salazar's prejudice and said, "This is our house, the house of pure blood, the house that keeps the old families together against the dilution of the world." Anne. After the war, that claim collapsed, and it collapsed not because anyone defeated it in argument, but because the house simply kept sorting whoever it sorted. The hat had never cared about blood. It looked for a particular cast of mind, ambition and cunning, and the willingness to use unorthodox means to reach your goals, and it put those children in green, whether their parents were ancient purebloods or Muggle dentists. Every Muggle-born Slytherin was living proof that Salazar's heirs had been squatting in a house that was never theirs by right. The war, by discrediting blood purity so completely, finally pried the house loose from the people who had claimed it, and handed it back to the much larger and much more interesting population of the merely ambitious. Anne. You can watch this happen in the public mind across the decade after the war, if you follow how the wizarding press talked about the house. In the first years, the Daily Prophet and its readers used Slytherin as lazy shorthand for suspicion. A crime reported, a hint that the suspect had been a Slytherin, and the readers filled in the rest. As the years passed and the Slytherins of the new generation moved out into the world, that shorthand stopped working because it kept being contradicted by reality. The brilliant young healer at St. Mungo's, who had been a Slytherin. The reformer pushing through better protections for magical creatures, who had been a Slytherin. The Auror, the inventor, the kind and patient teacher. Eventually, it became faintly embarrassing to use the old shorthand. The way it becomes embarrassing to repeat any prejudice that the evidence has worn through. The change was not announced. It was simply that one day the joke stopped landing, and people noticed it had stopped, and the house breathed a little easier. This did not mean Slytherin became a house of saints. It did not, Anne. It remained what it had always been underneath, a house of the ambitious and the cunning, and ambition and cunning produced their share of difficult people. There were still Slytherins who were sharp-elbowed, who played the angles, who wanted to win more than they wanted to be liked. There were still rivalries with Gryffindor on the Quidditch pitch that turned ugly, Anne. There were still students in green who used their cleverness for small cruelties rather than great achievements. A house does not stop containing the full range of human behavior just because the war is over. But the difference, the one that mattered, was that these were now understood as ordinary flaws of ordinary people rather than as proof of some deep house-wide rot. A scheming Slytherin was, after the war, just a scheming person who happened to wear green, the way a reckless Gryffindor is just a reckless person who happens to wear red. The colours stopped carrying a moral sentence. That was the whole of the recovery, really. The day the colours stopped being a verdict. Anne. There were individual lives moving through all of this, and a few of them are worth following, because the house's recovery was the sum of what happened to its people. Theodore Nott, the quiet, clever boy with the imprisoned father, built himself a life out of the rubble of his family name. He had the one thing that the war could not take from a Slytherin, which was his mind, and he used it. He did not try to restore the old family glory, which was gone, and which he had never much wanted anyway. He went into a line of careful scholarly work, the kind of thing where a sharp mind matters more than a clean surname, and he made himself useful and then respected, and finally, slowly, accepted. Anne. He never quite escaped the small flinch his name produced in certain rooms, but he outlived the worst of it, and he raised his own children with no allegiance to the cause that had ruined his father. The Nott name, which had meant Death Eater for a generation, came to mean, in his children's time, simply a clever and rather private family, with an old history they did not much discuss. That is a kind of victory, the quiet kind, the kind that takes 30 years and never makes the papers. Nott never sought the recognition and never got it, and he seemed, by all accounts, not to mind. He had learned the hard way that the loud kinds of success, the influence and the standing his father had chased, were brittle things that a single bad war could shatter overnight. What he built instead was quieter and more durable, a life of useful work and private decency that no political turn could take from him, and he held on to it precisely because it asked for no one's approval. There are people who rebuild after a catastrophe by trying to win back everything they lost, and there are people who rebuild by deciding they never wanted most of it anyway. And Nott was the second kind, and the second kind tends to sleep better. Daphne Greengrass, the elder of the two Greengrass sisters, lived the comfortable and unremarkable life that her family's careful neutrality had bought them. She had stayed out of the war, and the war stayed out of her, and she moved into adulthood with her position and her fortune and her good name intact. There is not much story in her, and that is itself the point. For a Slytherin to have an unremarkable life after the war, to simply grow up and marry and prosper without scandal or tragedy, was its own small refutation of the idea that the house was cursed. Most Slytherins were Daphnes, not Dracos. Anne. They were people whose lives the war touched lightly or not at all, who went on to be ordinary members of wizarding society, and whose ordinariness was invisible, precisely because it was ordinary. The legend remembers the villains and the casualties. It forgets the vast majority who simply lived. Daphne lived, and married, and grew old, and was happy in the small ordinary ways that never make a story, and there were thousands upon thousands of Slytherins exactly like her, the great quiet majority, whose only crime had been the colour of a school robe, and whose unremarkable contentment was the truest refutation of everything the legend claimed about their house. Their ordinary lives were the real answer, repeated 10,000 times over. If you want the single fact that did the most to change how the world saw Slytherin after the war, it is not any of the living. It is a dead man, and the slow public discovery of who he had really been. Severus Snape. For 7 years, the students of Hogwarts had known Snape as the cold, unfair, sneering potions master, the head of Slytherin who favoured his own and tormented everyone else. And then, in the last terrible year, as the headmaster installed by Voldemort himself, the man who had murdered Albus Dumbledore on the astronomy tower while the school watched. When the war ended, Snape was dead, killed by Voldemort in the Shrieking Shack, and the wizarding world's verdict on him seemed settled. A traitor, a murderer, the worst of what Slytherin could produce, a Death Eater who had risen all the way to headmaster and used the post to serve the darkness. Then Harry Potter told the truth, and the truth turned the whole verdict inside out. Because Severus Snape had not been Voldemort's man, he had been Dumbledore's, all along, for nearly 20 years, the most important double agent of the entire war. The murder on the tower had been planned between Snape and Dumbledore themselves. A mercy and a strategy. Dumbledore already dying and choosing to die at Snape's hand, rather than let a boy's soul be torn by the act. Every cruelty Snape performed in that last year, as headmaster, had been a careful performance, hiding the fact that he was protecting the students as much as he possibly could from within, softening Voldemort's orders, keeping the worst monsters at bay, all while pretending to serve them. He had spent his whole adult life as a man hated by both sides, trusted fully by neither, carrying a secret that would have gotten him killed in an instant if it were known, and he had carried it to the end out of love for a woman who had died 16 years before, Lily Potter, Harry's mother, whom he had loved since they were children, and whose death he had spent the rest of his life trying to atone for. When that story came out, when Harry stood in front of the Wizengamot and the public and made sure that everyone knew what Snape had truly done, it did something that no argument about Salazar Slytherin ever could have. It put at the very centre of the war's heroism a Slytherin. The bravest man Harry Potter ever knew, by his own repeated account, was the head of Slytherin House. Not brave in the loud Gryffindor way, the way of charging the enemy with your wand up. Brave in the colder, lonelier, more sustained way of living a lie for 20 years, hated and alone, because it was the only way to do the necessary thing. That is a Slytherin kind of courage to the bone. The courage of cunning and endurance, and the willingness to be misunderstood, and the war's greatest hero had it. Snape's portrait did not, at first, hang in the headmaster's office. He had abandoned the post, technically, by fleeing the school in the moment Voldemort's hold broke, and the magic of the office is particular about such things. But Harry made sure that this was corrected, that the man who had died for the cause was honoured as a true headmaster of Hogwarts. And in time, Snape's portrait took its place on the wall among all the others, the long line of headmasters and headmistresses watching over the school, a Slytherin who had served the light at the cost of everything, hanging in the highest office of the castle. The students who came up after the war grew up knowing that story. Anne. They grew up knowing that one of the war's true heroes had worn their colours, and that he was honoured for it, and that fact sat in the foundation of the house's recovered pride, like a stone that no slander could move. Snape was not alone in the house's history either, once people went looking. Anne. There had always been Slytherins who resisted the darkness, and after the war the wizarding world began, slowly, to remember them. There was Regulus Black, for one, a name that meant almost nothing to the public for years, and then came to mean a great deal. Regulus had been a Slytherin, the younger son of the ancient and fanatically pure-blood Black family, raised to believe everything Voldemort preached, and he had joined the Death Eaters as a proud young man, eager to serve. And then he had discovered something about what his master truly was, the lengths to which Voldemort had gone to cheat death, the existence of the Horcruxes, the casual evil of the methods. And Regulus Black, a teenage Death Eater from the purest of pure-blood families, had turned. He had gone alone, with only his house elf for help, to a hidden cave to steal and destroy one of Voldemort's anchors to life, knowing it would almost certainly kill him. It did kill him. He died young and unknown, his act of defiance buried for years, and when it finally came to light, it added another Slytherin to the quiet role of the house's secret heroes. A boy who had been raised to be a villain and chose, at the cost of his life, to be something better. Voldemort never even knew it had happened. Regulus had been cunning to the end, his rebellion hidden so well that his master died, still believing his Horcrux was safe. These stories accumulated. Snape, Regulus, Slughorn coming back to fight, Narcissa's lie in the forest, the Greengrasses refusing the cause, the countless ordinary Slytherins who had simply declined to become monsters. Laid end to end, they made a different history of the house than the one everyone had been telling. Not a history without darkness, because the darkness was real, and the house had produced Voldemort himself and would never be able to pretend otherwise. But a history with light woven all through it, a history in which the House of the Serpent had, again and again, in its quiet and cunning way, produced people who did the right thing when it counted, often at terrible cost, and usually without recognition. The recognition came late, after the war, when the world finally had the leisure and the honesty to go looking. And when it looked, it found that Slytherin had never been only what its enemies said. The institutions of the new wizarding world made room for Slytherins as the years passed, which was its own slow proof of recovery. Under Kingsley Shacklebolt and the ministers who followed him, the Ministry of Magic was rebuilt with at least the intention of fairness, and a Slytherin with talent could increasingly rise inside it. The Auror Office, which Harry himself would come to lead, took on Slytherins who proved themselves, and there is a particular fitness to a Slytherin Auror, a dark wizard catcher, with the cunning to think like the people they hunt. The Department of Magical Law Enforcement, St. Mungo's Hospital, the businesses of Diagon Alley, the schools and the shops and the Quidditch teams, all of them slowly stopped checking what colour a person had worn at school and started checking whether they were any good at the job. That is what recovery looks like in practice. Not a parade, not an apology, just the slow return of the assumption that a person should be judged by what they do. There is a grief that the winning side never has to think about, and it sat over Slytherin in the years after the war like a fog that would not lift. And it is worth naming, because mourning is part of what happened to the house, and almost no one outside it understood. When a war ends, the victors bury their dead as heroes. There are memorials, there are names read aloud, there are children told stories of the brave aunt or the brave grandfather who fell defending what was right. The grief is terrible, but it is allowed. It is held by the whole society, shared and honoured and woven into the public memory. The losing side gets none of that. The losing side buries its dead in silence, because to mourn them openly is to seem to defend the cause they died for. A Slytherin family that lost a son fighting on Voldemort's side, or a son like Vincent Crabbe who died in the chaos reaching for a dark magic he could not control, had to carry that grief alone, in private, with no memorial and no shared story, and the constant unspoken suggestion that the death had been deserved. The boy was still their boy. The mother still loved him as fiercely as any mother on the other side loved hers. But she could not say so out loud without inviting contempt, and so she grieved in the dark, and the war left a whole population of such mothers and fathers and sisters across the families of Slytherin. Mourning children they were not allowed to mourn. This is not an argument that the deaths were equal in their meaning. They were not. A young man who died trying to murder the defenders of Hogwarts did not die in the same cause as the defenders he was trying to kill, and pretending otherwise would be a lie. But grief is not an argument. Grief is just love with nowhere to go, and it does not check the politics of the person it is grieving. The families of Slytherin carried an enormous quantity of that homeless love after the war, and the wizarding world's refusal to make any room for it was one more weight pressing down on the house. One more reason the green and silver felt, for years, like the colours of a permanent and unforgivable mistake. Some of those families never recovered. They shrank into themselves, ashamed and isolated, the old fortunes dwindling, the children growing up in houses heavy with a sorrow no one would explain to them. Others found their way through, usually because someone in the family insisted on it, refused to let the whole bloodline be defined by its worst chapter, taught the next generation to look forward rather than back. The difference between the families that recovered and the families that did not was almost never about money or name or even guilt. It was about whether someone had the strength to say, out loud inside those walls, that the dead could be loved and the cause could be wrong, at the same time that a child of this family was free to become something the war had not chosen for them. The families where someone said that survived. The families where no one could bear to say it slowly faded. That, in the end, is the whole problem of Slytherin compressed into a single household. The house's recovery was nothing more than the same thing happening on a vast scale. Many someones had to keep insisting that the worst Slytherins were not the only Slytherins, that the values of the house were not the crimes of its most famous members, that a clever, ambitious child in green was free to become anything at all. McGonagall insisted on it from the headmistress's office. Slughorn insisted on it in the dungeons. Harry insisted on it at the trials and, later, in the way he raised his own children. And the new generations of Slytherins insisted on it, simply by living good and ordinary and accomplished lives, drop by drop, until the insistence became the truth. The deepest part of that recovery was the slow reclaiming of ambition itself, because the war had managed to make ambition look like a vice, and ambition is the beating heart of Slytherin House. Think about what ambition actually is. Stripped of the sneer the word had acquired, it is the desire to be more than you currently are. The hunger to build, to achieve, to leave a mark, to climb. There is nothing dark in it. Every great healer is ambitious. Every reformer, every inventor, every person who ever looked at the world and thought, I can make something better here, is driven by ambition. The problem is that ambition is also the engine of tyrants, because a tyrant is simply an ambitious person who has stopped caring who they hurt on the way up. Voldemort was ambition with the conscience torn out. And because the most spectacular failure of ambition the wizarding world had ever seen had come wearing Slytherin green, the whole house's defining virtue got tangled up with the crimes of its most monstrous son. To be ambitious after the war was to be a little suspect, as though wanting to rise were the first step on the road to wanting to rule. It took years to pull those two things apart in the public mind, ambition from tyranny, and the Slytherins who did the pulling did it not by arguing but by example. They were ambitious, openly, unashamedly, and they used that ambition to build things rather than to dominate people. The Slytherin, who became the youngest department head at the ministry, not by treachery, but by being genuinely the best. The Slytherin, who built a thriving business and treated their workers well. The Slytherin healer, who was driven, relentless, hungry to be the finest in their field, and who poured all of that hunger into saving lives. Each of them was a small lesson that ambition is a tool, and that a tool takes its meaning from the hand that holds it. The same drive that built Voldemort built, in other hands, every good and useful thing the house ever produced. The war had slandered the virtue by pointing at its worst abuser. The peace, slowly, redeemed it by pointing at everyone else. No single life carried more of the house's burden into the new age than Draco Malfoy's, so let us follow him out of the Great Hall and into the rest of his life. Slowly, the way the years actually went. Draco walked out of the war a survivor of a very particular kind, the kind who has done terrible things, failed to do worse ones, and is left to live with both the doing and the failing. He had taken the dark mark as a 16-year-old, more out of terror and family duty than conviction. And he had spent the year that followed discovering that being a Death Eater was nothing like the cruel daydream of power he had carried at school. He had been ordered to murder Albus Dumbledore, and he had climbed the astronomy tower to do it, and at the last moment, with the most powerful and gentle wizard of the age standing disarmed in front of him, he had found that he could not. He had lowered his wand. Whatever else was true of Draco Malfoy, that moment was also true. When it came to it, with the chance to become a killer right there in his hand, he turned out not to have it in him. Snape had finished the deed, by arrangement, and Dumbledore had died. But the boy had failed to be a murderer, and that failure was the most important thing he ever did. He carried it badly at first. The year inside the occupied manor, watching his family humiliated and his home turned into a torture chamber, watching people die in his own dining room, had hollowed him out. By the time of the final battle, he was a frightened boy who wanted nothing more than to survive and to keep his parents alive. The swagger of his school days burned entirely away. In the room of requirement, when his own friends' cursed fire turned on them, it had been Harry Potter who turned back to save him, and Draco had ended the war owing his life to the boy he had spent years tormenting. There is no comfortable way to live with a debt like that. He did not become Harry's friend. The two of them would never be friends, not really. But something between them had changed. Some old hatred had burned down to a wary, exhausted mutual recognition. Two young men who had been on opposite sides of a catastrophe and had both, somehow, come out the other side alive. The early years after the war were quiet ones for Draco, by necessity. The Malfoy name was a liability now, and he was wise enough finally to understand that the old game of influence and display was over. He did not try to rebuild the family's lost power at the ministry. He did not push his way back into the center of society. He withdrew, mostly, to the manor and to the careful business of staying out of trouble. A young man in his early 20s, with a famous face and a poisoned name, learning how to live small after a childhood spent learning how to live large. There was a humility in it that no one who had known the boy would have predicted. The arrogance that had defined him at school had been a brittle thing, a performance of superiority by a child who had been told all his life that he was better than everyone else. The war shattered it, and what was left underneath, once the pieces settled, was a quieter and more uncertain person, someone who had learned the hard way that his family's certainties had been lies, and who was now trying to work out what to believe instead. He was not, in those years, a happy man. How could he have been? Anne. He had grown up inside a worldview that the war had proven both wicked and catastrophically wrong, and a person does not simply set down a worldview like that and pick up a better one overnight. The blood purity creed had been the water he swam in since birth, taught by a father he had worshipped, and a wider family that treated it as obvious fact. To reject it, he had to reject a great deal of who he had been and much of what he had been taught to love, and that is slow, painful work that no one can do for you. Anne. Draco did it gradually, in private, over years, the way most people change, by living long enough to see the old certainties fail again and again until even a stubborn man cannot hold them anymore. He never made a public renunciation. He never wrote a confession or gave a speech. He simply, over time, became a different kind of man than his father, and the clearest proof of it was the family he chose to build. The turning point of Draco Malfoy's life, the thing that pointed him away from his father's path for good, was a woman named Astoria Greengrass, and to understand what she meant to him, you have to understand what she came from. Astoria was the younger of the two Greengrass sisters, from that old neutral family who had refused to fight on either side of the war, Anne. But neutrality in a family is not the same as indifference in its children, and Astoria had grown up with something that set her apart from almost everyone in Draco's world. Her family had been pure blood for generations, sacred in the old phrase, and yet they had come to despise the doctrine of blood purity, to see it for the small and frightened thing it was. Astoria had been raised by people who had every reason, by the logic of the old families, to be proud of their pure blood, and who had instead decided that the whole idea was beneath them. Anne. She grew up believing that a person's worth had nothing to do with their ancestry, and she believed it not as a rebellion against her upbringing, but because of it, because her own family had taught her so. She was, by the accounts of those who knew her, gentle in a way that had nothing weak about it. There was a steadiness in her, a quiet refusal to be cruel, a kindness that did not need to announce itself. She was not strong in body. She carried a blood malediction, an old curse on her family line that left her health fragile her whole life, and would in the end take her early. Living with that fragility seemed to have burned away anything petty in her. She had no time for the games of status and spite that consumed the world she had been born into. She wanted instead the things that actually matter to a person who knows their time is short: to love and be loved, to raise a child well, to be kind while she could. What she saw in Draco Malfoy, and what he saw in her, is the kind of thing that the loud history of the war never bothers to record. And yet, it changed the future of one of the most famous families in the wizarding world. She saw perhaps the quieter man underneath the ruined name, the one who had lowered his wand on the tower, the one who was trying, clumsily and in private, to become something other than what he had been raised to be, and he saw in her a vision of a different way to be a Malfoy, a way that kept the old family's pride and intelligence, and dropped the poison, that held on to the dignity of an ancient line, while refusing the cruelty that had nearly destroyed it. She was living proof that you could come from the oldest blood in Britain and want nothing to do with blood purity. Anne, for a man trying to climb out of the wreckage of that exact doctrine, she must have looked like a door into a life he had not known was possible. They married, and the marriage was not a popular one in certain quarters. The remnants of the old pure blood society, the families who still privately clung to the creed even after the war had discredited it, looked at Astoria's open contempt for blood purity and disapproved. Some of them whispered that she was not a suitable match, that her family's softness had infected her, that a Malfoy ought to have married someone who understood the importance of keeping the old ideas alive. Draco married her anyway, and in marrying her against that disapproval, he made the clearest statement of his life about who he intended to be. The boy who had once parroted his father's prejudices chose as a grown man, a wife whose entire being was a refutation of them. Anne, you can measure how far a person has travelled by the company they choose, and Draco chose Astoria, and that choice told you everything. Anne, the marriage carried a weight beyond the two people in it, because the Malfoys were watched, and a watched family teaches by example whether it means two or not. When the most infamous pure-blood family of the recent war produced a marriage built on the open rejection of blood purity, it sent a small signal through the whole battered network of the old families, the ones still privately clinging to the creed, and the ones relieved to be done with it. Here was a Malfoy, of all people, the very name that had stood for the cause, choosing a wife whose entire bearing said the cause was beneath contempt. If the Malfoys could let it go, the signal ran, then perhaps the creed truly was finished. Perhaps the holdouts were defending something that even its former champions had abandoned. A single marriage does not change a culture, but it can mark a turning, can show the people watching which way the current is now running, and the marriage of Draco Malfoy and Astoria Greengrass marked, for the old families, the moment the current turned for good against the thing that had nearly destroyed them all. Their son was born some years after the war, and they named him Scorpius. Scorpius Hyperion Malfoy, a name in the old Malfoy tradition of stars and grand syllables, given to a boy who would grow up to be almost nothing like the Malfoys who came before him. Draco and Astoria raised Scorpius in a way that broke, deliberately and completely, with how Draco himself had been raised. Lucius Malfoy had raised his son on a diet of superiority and grievance, teaching him that the Malfoys were better than other people, that Muggle-borns were beneath them, that the world owed the family its deference. Draco and Astoria raised Scorpius on kindness. They taught him to be gentle. They did not feed him the blood purity creed, did not teach him to look down on anyone, did not pass along the poison that had been handed to Draco as though it were a birthright. They gave their son, instead, the one thing Draco's own childhood had lacked, which was the freedom to be a good person without first having to unlearn a lifetime of being told to be a cruel one. The boy who grew out of that upbringing was, by every account, one of the kindest and most decent children imaginable. Scorpius Malfoy was sweet-natured, bookish, a little awkward, desperate to be liked, incapable of the casual cruelty that had come so easily to his father at the same age. He carried the most feared surname of the recent war, and he was, himself, about as threatening as a kitten. There is a tenderness in that, and also a kind of justice. The Malfoy line, which had spent generations growing harder and colder and prouder, finally produced a child who was soft in all the right places, and it produced him on purpose, because his parents had decided that the family would be different now. Scorpius did not have an easy childhood, despite all that love, because the world had not finished punishing the Malfoy name, and a child cannot be shielded from everything. There was a rumour that attached itself to him, a dark and cruel rumour that followed him into his school years, that he was not really Draco's son at all, but the secret child of Voldemort himself, conceived through some terrible dark magic before the Dark Lord's fall. It was nonsense, the invention of small minds reaching for the most poisonous story they could imagine. But rumours do not need to be true to wound, and this one wounded a gentle boy badly. To be the heir of Malfoy was burden enough. To be whispered about as the secret spawn of the most evil wizard who ever lived, when you were in truth one of the kindest children in your year, was a cruelty almost too neat. The war reaching forward across 2 decades to lay its filth on someone who had not even been born when it happened. That rumor tells you that the work of Slytherin's recovery was not finished, even a generation on. The old fear had not vanished. It had only gone quiet, and it still woke up now and then to fasten itself onto a child who bore the wrong name. But notice the shape of it, because the shape is hopeful. The cruelty now had to be invented. In the years right after the war, you did not need a rumor to despise a Malfoy. The name alone was enough. By Scorpius's time, despising him required making something up, dressing the old prejudice in a fantastical lie, because the plain truth of the boy, that he was sweet and bookish and harmless, gave no one any reason to fear him at all. Prejudice that has to invent its own justification is prejudice on its last legs. It is loud and it is painful, but it is losing, because reality has stopped cooperating with it. Astoria did not live to see her son grown. The blood malediction that had shadowed her whole life took her while Scorpius was still a boy, and Draco Malfoy, who had lost so much already, lost the person who had shown him how to be a different man, and was left to raise their gentle son alone, Anne. There is something almost unbearable in that, and something that completes the long arc of Draco's life. The boy who had been raised by a cold and prideful father became, himself, a widowed father raising a motherless son, and he chose in his grief to be the opposite of what his own father had been. He held Scorpius close. He protected him from the rumors as best he could. He let the boy be soft, let him be kind, let him be afraid and awkward and good, never once trying to harden him into the Malfoy mold that had so nearly destroyed them all. Whatever Draco Malfoy had been at 16, the man who raised Scorpius alone after Astoria's death was a father doing the single most important thing a parent can do, which is to give his child a better childhood than he himself had been given. He broke the chain. The cruelty stopped with him. Anne. The Greengrasses and the families like them, the ones who stayed neutral, left behind a question that the years after the war never fully resolved, and it is a question worth turning over. Was their neutrality wisdom, or was it cowardice? Anne. They had seen the darkness rising and chosen not to fight it, had kept their heads down and their families safe while other people died, stopping the thing they declined to oppose. There is a hardness in that, a willingness to let others pay the price of a victory you intend to enjoy. And yet they had also refused to join the darkness, had declined to lend their old names and their pure blood to a cause that wanted them badly. And in a time when many families of their standing threw in with Voldemort, simply refusing to do so was not nothing. Anne. The truth is probably that their neutrality was both at once, both the wisdom that kept their children alive, and the cowardice that left the fighting to braver people, and that most of the choices people make in a war are exactly that mixed. Neither clean heroism, nor clean villainy, but something muddy in between. The New World judged the neutral families gently, on the whole. They had not killed anyone, they had not served the dark, and from one of those careful, compromised, neither brave nor wicked families came Astoria, who would do more to redeem the Malfoy name than any act of wartime courage could have, which is its own small argument that survival is not the same as failure, and that the people who merely endure a catastrophe sometimes carry forward the seeds of the healing that comes after. Anne. Step back from the Malfoys for a moment, and let us look at the house as a whole moving through those years. Because while the famous family was working out its private redemption, the ordinary life of Slytherin was knitting itself back together day by day inside the castle. The Sorting Tat had been trying to tell the school something for years before the war ever reached its peak. The Hat, which is older than any living person and has watched 1,000 years of students pass beneath its brim, had begun, in the troubled seasons leading up to the worst of the conflict, to break with its own ancient custom. Instead of simply praising each house's virtues as it had always done, it had started to warn. It sang of the founders' original friendship and of the quarrel that broke them apart, and it pleaded with the school to unite, to stand together, because the dangers gathering outside the walls would feed on any division within them. The Hat could see what was coming. Anne. It knew that a school divided against itself by house rivalry would be easy prey for an enemy that wanted exactly that division. And it used the only voice it had, once a year, to beg the children to remember that they had more binding them together than driving them apart. The school had not really listened, not at the time. House rivalry was too old and too comfortable, and Slytherin in particular was too easy to cast as the enemy within. But after the war, the hat's old warning took on a new weight, because everyone had seen now exactly where division led. They had seen the school nearly torn apart from inside, seen students set against students, seen a whole house marched out under suspicion while the others fought. The hat had warned them and they had not heeded it, and the cost had been paid in the Great Hall, on the morning the bodies were laid out. After that, the plea for unity was no longer just a song. It was a lesson the whole school had learned the hard way, and the slow rebuilding of decent relations between the houses was in part the school finally doing what the hat had been asking it to do all along. That rebuilding showed up first, oddly enough, on the Quidditch pitch. House rivalry runs hottest in sport, and the matches between Gryffindor and Slytherin had always carried an edge of real venom, the green and red flags waving at each other across the stands like the banners of warring nations. After the war, that edge softened, not all at once, and not completely but noticeably. It is hard to scream for the destruction of the other team when half of you have just survived an actual war together. When the boy you are about to play against lost a brother in the same battle that took your cousin. The matches stayed fierce because they were supposed to be, but the venom drained slowly out of them, replaced by something closer to ordinary sporting rivalry. The kind where you want badly to win, and you shake hands afterward and mean it. A Slytherin seeker and a Gryffindor seeker, chasing the same snitch, both of them children of a world that had nearly ended, neither of them carrying the old hatred their parents' generation had carried. Sport became, as it sometimes can, a place where a wound healed faster than anyone expected, because it gave the houses a way to compete that did not require them to hate. Inside the Slytherin common room, life went on in its own rhythm, mostly invisible to the rest of the castle. The green light still moved on the stone walls. The fire still burned in the carved fireplace. First years still arrived, each autumn, nervous and small, and were welcomed by the older students and shown the ropes, taught where the dormitories were and how to find the kitchens, and which professors would forgive a late essay and which would not. The portraits of old Slytherins still watched from the walls, and over the years the room collected new stories to tell. Stories that were not about the war, the ordinary epic of school life, the romances and the rivalries and the triumphs and the small disasters that fill the years of any child anywhere. A house is not its reputation. A house is the daily life lived inside it, and the daily life inside Slytherin, once the worst of the suspicion lifted, became again what it had always been underneath. The ordinary, warm, complicated home of a few dozen ambitious children doing their best to grow up. There were friendships across the house lines, now in a way there had not been before, slowly, carefully, child by child. A Slytherin and a Gryffindor becoming friends had once been almost unthinkable, a small scandal, a betrayal of one's own. And after the war it became merely unusual, and then merely uncommon, and eventually, in the generation that came up clean, simply a thing that happened sometimes without anyone thinking much about it. The walls between the houses which the founders had built and the centuries had hardened started to grow a few doors. Not many, and not quickly, but a few, and a few was infinitely more than there had been. The hat had asked the school to unite. After the war, in its slow and partial and human way, the school began at last to try. The wider wizarding culture took longer to change than the school did, because a culture is slower and heavier than a single castle, but it did change, and you could trace the change in the way the war itself came to be remembered. In the first years, the story of the war was told as a clean morality tale, and clean morality tales need a villain that is bigger than any one man. Voldemort was the villain, of course, but Voldemort was dead, and a dead villain is unsatisfying. So the storytelling instinct reached for something that had survived, something that could still be pointed at, and it found Slytherin. The house became, in the popular memory of those years, a kind of standing villain, the reservoir from which all dark wizards were assumed to flow. Tell a child about the war, and you would tell them about the brave Gryffindor who lived, and the snakes who served the Dark Lord, and the child would absorb, along with the true heroism, the false and lazy lesson that green meant evil. Over time, the historians and the storytellers who actually cared about the truth began to push back on that, and the pushing back was its own slow subtle, fought in books and lessons, and the patient correction of one child's misunderstanding at a time. The true history was more complicated and less satisfying than the morality tale, and it took effort to tell, because it required holding several things in your mind at once. That the house had produced Voldemort, that the house had also produced Snape and Regulus, and Slughorn's late courage and Narcissa's saving lie, that the house's defining values were not crimes, that the house had been treated unjustly after the war, and had despite that recovered. None of this fits on a banner, all of it is true. The work of replacing the simple false story with the complicated true one was the cultural version of what Draco was doing in private, and what the school was doing on the Quidditch pitch. The same labour of separating the crimes from the colours, repeated across an entire society, and it took a generation. The war generation began to age, and as it did, the question of memory passed to people who had not lived through it. This is how every great wound heals in the end. Not by being forgotten, which would be its own kind of failure, but by passing into the hands of people who can look at it without the heat of having been there. The children who grew up after the war could hold the history of Slytherin more honestly than their parents could, precisely because they had no scar of their own to defend. They could see that the house had been wronged after the war without feeling that admitting it betrayed their own dead. They could honour the Gryffindor heroes and also acknowledge the Slytherin ones without any sense of contradiction. The peace that the war generation could not quite manage, weighed down as they were by grief and guilt, and the memory of who had stood where, came more easily to the generation after, who inherited the history as history rather than as a wound. The portraits in the headmaster's office tell the story as well as anything. By the time enough years had passed, the wall held Dumbledore, of course, and Snape, the Slytherin who had served the light at the cost of everything, and the long line of all the headmasters and headmistresses stretching back through the centuries, a great many of whom had themselves been Slytherins, because the house had always produced its share of the school's leaders. A child standing in that office, looking up at all those painted faces, would have no way of sorting them by house, no way of knowing which of those wise old wizards had worn green as students. They were simply the leaders of the school, honoured together, their houses long since beside the point. That is what recovery finally looks like. Not a special pardon for Slytherin, not a grand gesture of reconciliation, but the simple arrival of a day when the question of what house someone had been in stopped being the most important thing about them. We are about halfway through our long night together now, and we have come from the morning after the battle all the way to the quiet healing of a house's name. So, let me slow down for just a moment before we go on toward the children of the people we have been following. If these calm histories are helping you unwind, a gentle tap on the like button is the one small thing that helps more tired souls find their way here on the nights when sleep will not come easily. And if you have a thought drifting through your mind right now, the name of a Slytherin you always felt was misunderstood, or simply how the day has treated you, leave it in the comments and let this little community know you are here. There is no need to stir. You can do it in the morning if you do it at all. For now, just keep breathing slow and let us carry on into the years that came after, when the children of the war became the students of the peace. 19 years passed. That is the span the story is usually measured in, the 19 years from the end of the war to a particular bright autumn morning at a train station in London. And it is worth standing on that platform, because what happened there belongs to Slytherin as much as to anyone, and almost no one tells it from the green side. On the 1st of September, 19 years after the Battle of Hogwarts, the platform at King's Cross filled with families seeing their children off to school, the same as it had every year for centuries. The Hogwarts Express stood waiting in its scarlet paint, steam drifting up into the iron rafters, and among the families on that platform were faces that the war had once set against each other, now standing a little apart, but in the same crowd, parents grown grey and settled, watching their own children prepare to climb aboard the train that had carried them to the same school a generation before. Draco Malfoy was on that platform, older now, his pale hair beginning to recede, his face carrying the lines of a man who had buried a wife and raised a son through grief. Beside him stood Scorpius, off to his first or one of his early years at Hogwarts. The gentle boy with the feared name, nervous the way all children are nervous before the train. And across the crowded platform stood Harry Potter, grey creeping into his hair as well, with his own wife and children, the famous scar long since faded into just another old mark on a middle-aged face. The two men saw each other across the steam and the crowd. There was no embrace. There was no warm reunion, no laughing over old times, because they had never been friends and the things that lay between them could not be laughed away. But Draco caught Harry's eye, and he gave a small nod, a brief and stiff acknowledgement across the distance, and Harry nodded back. That was all. Two men, who had been boys on opposite sides of a war, who had hated each other, who had saved each other, who had testified and survived and grown old, giving each other a single nod across a train platform, while their children prepared to go off to the same school. It was not friendship. It was something quieter, and in its way more remarkable, the simple peace of two old enemies who have decided to let the war stay in the past where it belongs. A nod is a small thing. Between those two, after everything, it was enormous. And then there was the boy, Albus Potter, Harry's younger son, named in part for Severus Snape, the Slytherin, who had been the bravest man his father ever knew. Albus was frightened that morning, and the thing he was frightened of cuts to the very center of everything we have been talking about all night. He was afraid of being sorted into Slytherin. Anne. He had heard the stories, the way every child hears the stories, that Slytherin was the dark house, the house of the bad wizards, and he was terrified that the hat would put him there, that he would have to wear green, that he would somehow become one of the people he had grown up being taught to fear. What his father said to him in that moment did more for the house of Slytherin than any trial, or any portrait, or any passing of the years. Harry knelt down to his frightened son and told him the truth that the long aftermath of the war had taught the whole wizarding world if it was willing to learn it. He told Albus that he had been named after two headmasters of Hogwarts, and that one of them, the one whose name he carried, had been a Slytherin and had been the bravest man Harry had ever known. Anne. He told his son that if the hat did place him in Slytherin, then the house would be gaining a fine young wizard, and that it would make no difference to how much his family loved him. None at all. And he told him gently that the hat takes your own wishes into account, that Harry himself had once asked the hat to keep him out of Slytherin, and the hat had listened, so that if it truly mattered to Albus, he could ask too. Sit with what that means coming from that man. Harry Potter, the boy who lived, the symbol of the war, the person with more reason than anyone alive to despise the house that had produced the monster who killed his parents and tried to kill him a dozen times over, knelt down and told his frightened son that being sorted into Slytherin would be no shame at all, that the house held heroes, that the bravest man he had ever known had worn its colours. The man who had every right to hate Slytherin had become, instead, the person who reassured a child that the house was nothing to fear. That is the whole arc of the aftermath in one moment on a train platform. The war's greatest hero, telling the next generation that the old story was wrong, that green was not a sentence, that a Slytherin could be the bravest soul in any room. The hat did place Albus in Slytherin. The son of Harry Potter, the grandson of Lily and James, the boy named for a Gryffindor headmaster and a Slytherin one, was sorted into the House of the Serpent, and he wore the green, and the sky did not fall. It was, in its quiet way, the final seal on Slytherin's recovery. As long as Slytherin was the house that other people's children got sorted into, the house could remain at arm's length, a thing to be wary of. The moment the boy who lived had a son in green, the moment the most famous family of the light had a Slytherin child whom they loved without reservation, the old wall came down for good. You cannot fear a house that holds your own children. The Potters had a Slytherin now, and they loved him, and that love was a thing no slander could survive. What happened next, between Albus Potter and Scorpius Malfoy, is the gentlest joke the war ever played on itself, and the kindest. Anne. The two boys met on the train, the way friendships at that school so often begin, in a compartment with the countryside sliding by outside the window. Albus Potter, the son of the most famous wizard alive, weighed down already by the impossible expectation of being Harry Potter's child and the dawning fear that he might not live up to any of it. And Scorpius Malfoy, the son of the most infamous family of the recent war, weighed down by the cruel rumor about his parentage and the loneliness of a name that made other children keep their distance. Anne, 2 boys, each of them an outsider, each of them carrying a surname that was too heavy for a child to lift, and they found each other, and they became the closest of friends. There is a perfection to it that no one could have planned. The descendants of the war's 2 great opposing families, Potter and Malfoy, the names that had stood for the light and the dark of the whole conflict, produced 2 sons who looked at each other and saw, instead of an enemy, the only other person who understood what it was like to be crushed under a name you never chose. Albus did not see the heir of the Death Eaters. He saw a kind, anxious, funny boy who loved books and was loyal past all reason and needed a friend as badly as Albus did. Scorpius did not see the Prince of the Light, Anne. He saw a fellow outcast, someone who knew what it was to disappoint a famous father, someone who would sit with him in the green common room and not care at all about the poison the rest of the world attached to his name, Anne. The 2 of them, sorted into Slytherin together, became inseparable, and their friendship was the war's old enmity dissolving in the hands of children who had never agreed to carry it. Draco Malfoy and Harry Potter, watching their sons become best friends, had to make a kind of peace with each other that the nod on the platform had only begun. It was not easy for either of them. There was too much history, too many old wounds, for the fathers to simply become friends because their boys had. Anne. But they were both fathers now, and a father will do a great deal for a child's happiness, including making room in his life for a man he never thought he would have to tolerate, Anne. When their sons got into trouble together, as sons will, the 2 of them had to stand side by side and work through it. 2 middle-aged men who had been enemies as boys, brought back into each other's lives by the friendship of their children. They came, in the end, to something like respect. Not warmth, exactly, but a recognition between 2 men who had each been damaged by the same war and were each trying, in their own way, to raise a son who would not be. They had more in common than either of them had ever wanted to admit. The war had marked them both, Anne, and now they were both watching their children refuse to inherit the hatred, and there was a strange comfort in watching it together. So the green and silver, which had begun this long night as the colours of suspicion, the banner hanging in an empty room while the other houses bled, ended it as the colours worn by Harry Potter's son and his best friend, 2 of the most beloved children of the new generation, Anne. The house had travelled from the morning after the battle, when half the world wanted it gone, to a place where it held the children of the Light's most famous family and held them gladly. That road took 19 years and a great deal of quiet, unglamorous work by people who mostly never got any credit for it. But it happened. The house survived, and more than survived. It came back to itself. Let us spend some time now in the house as it was a full generation after the war, because the place itself had changed in ways both visible and not, and there is a calm in walking its corridors once the worst of the story has been told. The common room under the lake looked, at a glance, exactly as it always had. The same green light filtered down through the deep water beyond the windows, shifting and rippling across the stone so that the whole room seemed to breathe with the slow movement of the lake above. A fire burned in the carved hearth as one always had. High-backed leather chairs still sat in their clusters, worn soft by 1,000 years of students. A boy like Scorpius Malfoy, sitting by that fire with a book on a winter evening, the snow falling unseen on the surface of the lake far above him, was sitting in the same spot where Slytherins had sat since the founding of the school, warmed by the same fire, watched by the same painted faces on the walls. Some things a war cannot touch. The stone keeps its shape, the lake keeps its colour, the fire goes on being lit, but the feeling of the room had changed, and the change was the whole point. The students who lived there now did not carry the war as their own. To them it was history, a thing that had happened to their parents and grandparents, important and terrible and finished. Anne. They did not flinch when they said which house they were in. They wore their green in the corridors without bracing for a sneer. Anne. They competed and studied and fell in and out of love and grew up, and the shadow that had hung over the house in the years right after the war had thinned, for them, into something they could mostly forget about. That forgetting was a kind of healing. Not the forgetting of the dead who deserve to be remembered, but the forgetting of the fear, the slow loosening of the grip that the war had held on every child in green. A house heals when its children can be ordinary in it, and the children of this generation were, at last, ordinary. They were also still recognizably Slytherins, because the house had not lost its character in becoming acceptable, and this is worth saying plainly. The recovery of Slytherin was never about turning it into a second Hufflepuff, scrubbing away its edge and making it soft and unobjectionable. That would have been its own kind of erasure. The house kept its ambition. It kept its cunning, its slyness, its taste for the clever indirect path over the blunt direct one. The students who came up through it after the war were still the kind of people who wanted to win, who thought 3 moves ahead, who valued resourcefulness, and were not above a bit of well-judged rule-bending in service of a goal. They were ambitious children, and they remained ambitious children, and the difference was only that the world had finally stopped treating ambition as a crime. Slytherin did not become good by ceasing to be Slytherin. It became good by being allowed, at last, to be Slytherin, without the slander attached. You could see the house's recovered confidence in its small traditions. The way the older students welcomed the first years each autumn had a new note in it, a kind of gentle pride, a sense that to be sorted into Slytherin was a fine thing, an inheritance worth having. The new students were told the house's history, honestly, the whole of it, the darkness and the light together. They were told about Voldemort, because it would have been a lie to leave him out, and they were told that the house had produced him, and that this was a real and permanent part of what it meant to wear green. But they were also told about Snape, the bravest man the war's greatest hero ever knew. They were told about Regulus, the boy who died young and unrecorded, turning against the Dark Lord he had once served. They were told about Slughorn coming back to fight when he had every excuse to run. They were given a history they could carry with their heads up, a history in which their house had done terrible things and noble ones, which is the only honest history any old institution can offer, because no 1,000-year-old thing is innocent, and none is wholly damned. There was a phrase that the house came to use about itself in those later years, an idea passed down from older students to younger ones, that the green and silver did not mean what their enemies said it meant. The serpent on the crest was not a symbol of evil. It never had been, not in the older traditions. The serpent was a symbol of wisdom, of transformation, of the patient and watchful intelligence that knows when to wait and when to strike. A snake sheds its skin and is renewed. A snake is silent and observant and survives by being cleverer than the things that would kill it. The house had taken a creature that frightened people and claimed it as a sign of exactly the qualities it prized. And after the war, as the house recovered its pride, that older meaning of the serpent came back into the light. To be a snake was not to be venomous. It was to be wise, to be watchful, to be capable of renewal. The house had shed its skin in the years after the war and come out new underneath, and the serpent on its crest had never been a better symbol for it than in those years of slow rebirth. Consider the sorting hat through all of this, because the hat did something through the years of Slytherin's disgrace that almost no living person managed, which was to never once or waver in its judgment of the house. The hat is the oldest piece of the sorting, older than any portrait, 1,000 years old, made by the 4 founders themselves and given a share of each of their minds so that it could choose for each new child the house that suited them best. It has sat on the heads of 1,000 years of students, looked into 1,000 years of young minds, and placed each child where they belonged. And all through the years after the war, while the rest of the wizarding world treated Slytherin as a thing to be feared and ashamed of, the hat went on sorting children into it, exactly as it always had, without hesitation, without apology, without the slightest concession to the world's opinion. A child with the ambition, the cunning, the resourcefulness, the willingness to use unorthodox means, went into Slytherin, and the hat did not care in the least that the world outside thought those qualities suspect. It knew what it had always known, that those qualities were gifts, that the house Salazar built to nurture them was a worthy house, and that the children who belonged there regardless of what any frightened generation thought about it. There was a steadiness in that which the house needed badly. Everything else in a Slytherin child's world might tell them their house was a disgrace. But the hat, the ancient impartial hat that had sorted every great witch and wizard in the school's history, looked into them and said, without doubt, you are a Slytherin, and meant it as the simple statement of fact it had always been. The hat did not sort children into Slytherin as a punishment or a warning. It sorted them there because that was who they were, and its calm refusal to treat the house as anything other than what it had always been was, in its way, the most authoritative defense the house ever had. The world's opinion of Slytherin rose and fell. The hat did not move at all. It had been right about the house for 1,000 years before the war, and it went it on being right about it after, placing the ambitious children where they belonged, trusting them to become whatever they would become, untroubled by the slander of a single frightened age. And the children the hat sorted, the new generation that came up clean after the war, did something with the house that no adult could have done for them, which was to remake it from the inside by simply being themselves. A prefect in green, a few years into the piece, walking the corridors with their badge, holding the younger Slytherins to a standard of decency, breaking up the old cruelties before they could start, teaching the first years by plain example that you could be ambitious without being cruel, clever without being cold. A Slytherin Quidditch captain who shook hands and meant it, who played hard and fair and refused to let the old venom back into the rivalry. A Slytherin student who befriended a Gryffindor in open defiance of 100 years of expectation and made the friendship ordinary by the simple fact of living it. These were not heroes in any way the history would record. They were just young people going about the business of growing up, who happened to be remaking the meaning of their house with every ordinary choice they made. They had inherited a name in disgrace, and rather than carry the disgrace or rage against it, they simply lived in a way that made the disgrace harder and harder to believe. Anne. A house is remade by its children, generation after generation, and the children who came up after the war remade Slytherin into something its enemies could no longer recognize, not through any grand statement, but through the slow daily work of being decent, ambitious young people in green, until the old slander had nothing left to hold on to. That is the thing the loud history can never quite capture, that the great changes are made by people who are not trying to make great changes, who are only trying to live well in the circumstances they were handed. The new generation of Slytherins did not set out to rehabilitate their house. They set out to get through school, to do well, to find their friends and their loves and their futures, the same as any young people anywhere. Anne. And in doing that, in the ordinary course of growing up decent, they accomplished what no campaign or proclamation could have, the quiet remaking of a 1,000-year-old house in their own better image. Anne. Not everyone in green was owed mercy, and the honest history of Slytherin after the war has to make room for the ones who genuinely deserved their punishment. Because a recovery built on pretending the house had no real villains would be no recovery at all. Anne. There were Death Eaters from Slytherin who had earned every year of the sentences they got, and the new ministry made sure they got them. The Carrows, Amicus, and Alecto, the brother and sister who had been installed at Hogwarts during the Dark Year to terrorize the students, who had taught torture as a subject and used children for practice, went to Azkaban and stayed there, and no one of any decency mourned it. They had been given power over helpless students, and they had used it for cruelty in its purest form, and the war's end found them on the losing side of a reckoning they had richly invited. There were others like them, the true believers and the sadists, the ones who had not been swept up by fear or family pressure, but had chosen the darkness because it gave them license to be the monsters they had always wanted to be. The trials sent them where they belonged, and Slytherin's recovery never required pretending otherwise. The house had produced them. That was true, and it stayed true. A house can hold its head up about its heroes without lying about its villains, and the only honest pride is the kind that admits the whole account. Azkaban itself changed after the war in a way that says something about the new order Kingsley was trying to build. The prison had always been guarded by Dementors, those soulless creatures that feed on every happy thought and leave their prisoners in a living despair. During the war, the Dementors had gone over to Voldemort drawn to the darkness as they always were, and afterward Kingsley made a decision that the prison would no longer use them. The Dementors were removed from Azkaban. The prison remained, grim and isolated on its rock in the cold northern sea, and the worst of the war's criminals were still locked inside it. But it would no longer be a place of soul-eating torment. It would be a prison, hard and bleak, but not a hell. Even for the guilty, even for the Carrows and their kind. The new wizarding world drew a line it had not drawn before. A line that said punishment was one thing and torture was another, and that a society that used Dementors to break the souls of its prisoners had already lost something it could not afford to lose. The removal of the Dementors was a small administrative decision that almost no one celebrated, and it was also a sign of exactly the kind of world the war had been fought to make possible. Hardness without cruelty, justice without torment, and, for the Slytherins who fell somewhere in the wide middle, neither heroes nor monsters. The years after the war were a long and uneven reckoning. Gregory Goyle, who had survived the battle that killed his friend Crabbe, lived out a diminished and uncertain life. He had never been clever, never been a leader, only a follower who had attached himself to stronger personalities, and the war took away the people he had followed and left him adrift. He was not punished, having committed no crime that the trials could pin on him beyond the ordinary cruelties of a school bully, but he was not redeemed either. He simply faded into a small and unremarkable existence, a man who had bet on the wrong side as a boy and spent the rest of his life in the long grey aftermath of that bet. There is no lesson in Goyle, only the reminder that most of the people swept up in a great evil are not masterminds but followers, ordinary and limited people who lacked the wit or the courage to stand apart, and who are left, when it is over, with nothing much except the knowledge of which way they had leaned. Marcus Flint, the old Slytherin Quidditch captain, the brutal player from the years before the war, grew up into the kind of adult that such boys often become, neither better nor worse than the average. His school cruelties left behind with his school days. Adrian Pusey, Miles Bletchley, the names that fill the old team rosters, scattered into ordinary lives, some of them prospering, some of them struggling, none of them famous, all of them part of the great quiet mass of Slytherins who had simply been students and went on to simply be people. Millicent Bulstrode, Tracy Davis, Theodore Knott, the whole roll of names that the loud history never bothers to follow, lived out the unremarkable arcs of ordinary lives in a recovering world. That unremarkableness is again the deepest truth about the house. The villains were few, the heroes were few, the vast middle was just people, neither damned nor saved, getting on with the business of living in a world that had nearly ended and had not after all ended, and that now had to be lived in. Return to Draco one last time because his middle age completes a story that began with a frightened boy on a tower, and there is a piece at the end of it worth resting in. The old generation of Malfoys faded as the years passed, the way every generation does. Lucius, who had been so proud and so powerful, lived out his later years as a diminished man in a house that no longer feared him, his influence gone, his cause defeated, his certainties proven hollow. He had built his whole life on the conviction that blood was destiny, that the Malfoys were owed deference, that the old families were the rightful masters of the wizarding world. Anne. He lived long enough to watch every piece of that conviction crumble. He watched his son marry a woman who openly scorned the creed he had raised them both to revere. He watched his grandson grow up gentle and kind and entirely uninterested in the family's old pretensions. Anne. He watched the world move on into exactly the future he had fought to prevent. A future where blood meant nothing, and a Muggle-born could rise as high as any pure blood, and there was nothing he could do about any of it except grow old inside it. Whatever he made of that in the privacy of his own mind, he kept it to himself. The proud are rarely given the mercy of admitting they were wrong, and Lucius had been too proud for too long to find that mercy late. Draco was different, and the difference was the whole of what the war had taught him. Where his father had clung to the old certainties even as they failed, Draco had let them go, slowly and painfully, and built something better in their place. Anne. By his middle age, he was a man at something like peace with himself. Not because he had forgotten what he had done as a boy, but because he had spent his adult life becoming someone who would not do it again. He had raised a kind son. He had loved and lost a good woman. He had made an uneasy peace with his old enemy for the sake of their children's friendship. He carried the dark mark still, faded now on his aging arm, a permanent reminder of the worst choice of his youth, and he had learned to carry it not as a badge and not as a wound he hid in shame, but simply as a fact of his history, a thing he had done and could not undo and had spent decades trying to outweigh. A man can make his peace with his own past without pretending it was different than it was. Draco did that. It took him most of his life. The manor changed with him. Malfoy Manor had been, during the war, the headquarters of the Dark Lord himself. A place of torture and fear, its elegant rooms turned to terrible uses. After the war it remained family home, but the family living in it was no longer the family that had let those horrors happen there. A child grew up in those halls who was taught kindness instead of contempt. The rooms that had held prisoners held, in time, a boy's books and toys and the ordinary clutter of a childhood. You cannot scrub the history out of a house any more than you can scrub it out of a person, and the manor surely held its ghosts and its memories for everyone who knew what had happened there. But a house, like a house at school, takes its meaning from the life lived inside it, and the life lived inside Malfoy Matrona. In the generation after the war was a quieter and a kinder one than the wing of the family that built its dark reputation. The same stones, a different family living among them. That is as much redemption as any old and guilty house can hope for, and it is not nothing. What Draco Malfoy never got and never expected was forgiveness in any public form. There was no ceremony in which the wizarding world declared the Malfoys redeemed. There was no moment when Harry Potter clasped his hand and called him friend. The stain on the name faded but never fully lifted in his lifetime. He remained to most people who remembered the war, the Death Eater's son who had escaped Azkaban, the boy who had tried and failed to be a murderer, a figure of suspicion softening only slowly into a figure of indifference. He made his peace without the world's permission, which is the only kind of peace available to most people who have done real wrong. You do not get to be forgiven on a schedule. You only get to spend your days becoming someone who would not do it again, and to hope that the becoming counts for something, even if no one ever stands up to say so. Draco spent his days that way. Whether it was enough is not a question anyone can answer for him, but he raised a son who broke the chain, and a chain broken stays broken, and the kindness of Scorpius Malfoy is a real thing in the world that exists. Because a frightened boy on a tower grew into a father who refused to pass on the poison he had been fed. That is a legacy. It is a better one than his father left him. There is a larger shape to all of this, older than the war, older than Voldemort, reaching all the way back to the 4 friends who built the school, and it is worth tracing slowly, because the recovery of Slytherin was really the late healing of a wound 1,000 years old. In the beginning, the founders were friends. This is the part of the story that gets lost under everything that came after, and it is the part that matters most. Godric Gryffindor and Salazar Slytherin, before they were the names of rival houses, before they were a byword for the brave and the cunning set against each other, were close companions, 2 of the 4 greatest witches and wizards of their age, who came together out of friendship and shared purpose to build something that had never existed before. There was no school for magic in Britain in those days. Children with magic were born scattered across a hostile land, feared by their neighbours, often killed, their gifts wild and untaught and dangerous. The 4 founders looked at that and decided to build a refuge, a place where such children could be brought together and taught and kept safe, and they built it with their own hands and their own magic, and for a time it worked, and the 4 of them lived and taught together in the castle they had raised, friends and partners in the greatest project of their lives. The houses were not meant to divide them. The houses were meant to be the opposite, a way for each founder to teach the students who suited them best, to pass on the particular gifts each of them prized. Gryffindor would nurture the brave, Ravenclaw the brilliant, Hufflepuff the loyal and hard-working, Slytherin the ambitious and cunning. 4 kinds of excellence, 4 streams, feeding into one school. The differences are strength rather than a fault. A child sorted into Slytherin was meant to be celebrated, marked out as someone with the drive and the cleverness to do great things. That was the original idea. The houses were a way of honoring the variety of human gifts, not a way of sorting the good from the bad. The friendship broke over Salazar's prejudice, his insistence that the school close its doors to Muggle-born children, and when he left, the houses curdled. What had been 4 kinds of excellence began, over the centuries, to harden into 4 tribes, suspicious of one another, competing for points and glory and pride, the original generous idea slowly forgotten. And Slytherin, founded by the one who left in anger, carrying his prejudice in its bloodstream, hardened worst of all, until it became the thing its enemies said it was. A house too willing to shelter the kind of ambition that does not care who it hurts. The Chamber of Secrets sat under the school. As the physical sign of that hardening, Salazar's bitterness turned to stone and venom, waiting. 1,000 years of the founder's broken friendship led, in the end, to a boy named Tom Riddle opening that chamber, and from that boy to the war that nearly destroyed the school the 4 friends had built. So when the war ended and the long work of Slytherin's recovery began, that work was not really new, Anne. It was the resumption of something that had been interrupted 1,000 years before, Anne. Every step toward healing the division between the houses was a step back toward the founders' original friendship, Anne. The Sorting Hats' pleas for unity were pleased to remember what the founders had been before the quarrel. The softening of the rivalry on the Quidditch pitch, the friendships that grew across the house lines, the slow acceptance that a Slytherin could be a hero and a Gryffindor could be a fool, and that the colours were not a moral sentence, all of it was the school inching back toward the thing it had been built to be, a single refuge of 4 gifts, before the gifts were turned into tribes, and the tribes into enemies. The recovery of Slytherin was the recovery of the whole school's lost idea of itself, Anne. You could not heal the one without healing the other, because the wound was never really in Slytherin alone, Anne. The wound was in the division, and Slytherin had simply been the side of the division that got blamed for it. Whether the school ever fully healed that ancient wound is not a thing any one lifetime can witness. 1,000-year-old division does not close in 19 years, or in 50, or perhaps ever, completely. House rivalry is old and stubborn, and woven into the very stones of the place, Anne. But the direction had changed, and direction matters more than distance when you are talking about something that moves as slowly as a culture. Before the war, the houses had been drifting further apart. The rivalry hardening, the suspicion of Slytherin deepening with every dark wizard the house produced. After the war, the drift reversed. The houses began, slowly and partially and imperfectly, to move back toward one another, toward the friendship the founders had begun with and lost. A child sorted into Slytherin a full generation after the war was sorted into a house that was, for the first time in a very long time, moving in the right direction, back toward what it had been meant to be, back toward the honoured stream of ambition and cunning that Salazar had set out to nurture before his fear poisoned the well. Anne, that was the deepest meaning of the house's recovery. Not just that Slytherin was forgiven, but that the school, through forgiving it, took a step back toward being whole. Pull back even further now, away from the castle and the families, and look at the whole of the wizarding world as it carried the war into its memory. Because the recovery of one house was a small thread in a much wider mending. The world that came out of the war was tired in a way that lasts for decades. A society does not fight a civil war, watch its government captured, and its neighbours turned into informers and its children dragged into the fighting, and then simply shake it off and carry on. The trauma of it sat under everything for a long time, in the way people flinched at certain words, in the empty chairs at family tables, in the particular silence that fell when the war came up. The recovery of Slytherin happened inside that wider exhaustion and was shaped by it. People had limited patience for grudges because they were so worn down by the grudge that had nearly destroyed them all. The energy it takes to keep hating an entire house of children is considerable, and a society recovering from a war does not have much energy to spare. Some of Slytherin's recovery came not from anyone deciding to be fair, but simply from the fact that people were too tired to keep up the suspicion. And tiredness, in this one case, did the work of mercy. The generations kept turning as they do. The children who had been too young to fight grew up and had children of their own. And those children grew up hearing about the war, the way modern children hear about events that happened before they were born, as history, as something in books, as the reason for a memorial they walked past without much thought. For that third generation, the idea that Slytherin had once been treated as a house of villains was almost incomprehensible. They had grown up with Slytherin friends, Slytherin teachers, the children of old Slytherin families woven into their ordinary lives. The slander that had hung so heavy over the house in the years right after the war had by their time become a strange historical curiosity, a thing their grandparents had believed for reasons that no longer made any sense. That is how prejudice usually dies in the end. Not in a single dramatic moment of enlightenment, but in the slow arrival of a generation that simply cannot understand what the fuss was ever about. The famous names settled into their places in the history of the war. Harry Potter went on to a long life of public service, his children grown, his old enemies mostly dead or diminished. The boy who lived become a tired and decent man who had done the thing the world asked of him, and spent the rest of his days trying to live an ordinary life in the shadow of it. The Weasleys, the Grangers, the families of the light took their honoured places in the new world, and the Slytherins took theirs too. The heroes and the villains, and the great unremarkable middle, all of them sorted by the slow hand of time into the places history assigned them. Snape was remembered as a hero, his name carried by Harry Potter's own son. The Carrows were remembered as monsters, rotting in a prison no longer guarded by soul-eaters. The Malfoys were remembered as a cautionary tale that turned in the second generation into something gentler, and the thousands of ordinary Slytherins were, mostly, not remembered at all, which is the fate of ordinary people everywhere, and is not a tragedy, but simply the way of things. What the wizarding world learned from all of it, if it learned anything, was the danger of the simple story. Anne. The war had been made possible in part by the willingness of decent people to believe simple stories about whole groups of other people. Voldemort's entire movement was built on a simple story, that pure blood was better than muggle blood, that an entire category of people could be ranked and sorted and ultimately disposed of according to their ancestry, and the unjust treatment of Slytherin after the war was built on the mirror image of that same simple story, that an entire house could be judged by the worst of its members, that green meant evil, that you could know a person's worth from the colour of their school robes. The lesson, the hard and unglamorous lesson, was that the simple story is almost always a lie, that human beings come in every variety inside every category you can invent, and that the work of justice is the slow work of looking at people one at a time instead of in a mass. The wizarding world had nearly destroyed itself believing simple stories about people. The recovery of Slytherin was one small place where it learned, at great cost and over many years, to stop. Anne. There were women all through this story whose work held the losing side together, and they are worth their own moment because the recovery of Slytherin owed them a debt that the loud history never bothered to record. Narcissa Malfoy lived out her later years in a near-total retreat from the world she had once moved through with such confidence. The woman who had lied to the most dangerous wizard alive, who had ended the war with a single whispered falsehood told for love of her son, did not become a public figure or a celebrated heroine, and she withdrew instead into the privacy of family, into the work of holding her diminished household together, of supporting her broken husband and her uncertain son through the long grey years after the war. She had never cared for the cause the way Lucius had. The blood purity, the Dark Lord, the dream of mastery, all of it had been her husband's religion more than hers, and when it collapsed she felt, one suspects, less loss than relief. Because what she had wanted underneath all of it was only her family, alive and together, and that she had managed to keep. She had walked out of the Great Hall on the morning after the battle holding her son, having saved him by the only means available to her, and she spent the rest of her life simply being his mother, which was all she had ever truly wanted to be. There is no monument to Narcissa Malfoy. Anne. There should perhaps be a small one, because without her, the war might have gone otherwise, and she asked for nothing in return except to be left alone with the people she loved. She was one of many, Anne. Across the families of the losing side, it was most often the women who did the slow in keeping the children alive and the households intact through the years of disgrace. The mothers, and grandmothers and aunts, who refused to let their families dissolve into bitterness and ruin. Anne. They were the ones who insisted, inside the walls of grieving houses, that the next generation be given a chance at a different life. Anne. They were the ones who taught a child, gently, that the family name did not have to be a sentence, that there was a future worth growing toward, that the war was over and the living had to go on living. Anne. Much of the recovery of Slytherin happened in those private rooms, in the patient daily labour of women who never appeared in any account of the war, who simply held their families steady through the worst of it and pointed the children toward the light. The grand history remembers the duelling and the dying. It forgets the harder and longer work that came after, the work of keeping a broken family from breaking further, and that work was done, in house after house, mostly by women whose names no one wrote down. Anne. There is a particular strength in that kind of quiet endurance, the strength of the people who hold things together while the world is looking elsewhere. The wizarding world celebrated its warriors, the ones who fought in the great battle, and they deserved celebrating. But the recovery that came afterward was not won by warriors. It was won by people with patience, the ones who could get up every morning into a world that despised their family and choose again to be decent, to raise their children well, to keep going without any expectation of reward or recognition. That is a harder and less glamorous courage than the kind that wins by battles. And the women of Slytherin's broken families had it in abundance, and the house has justified its survival to them, as much as to anyone whose name the history happened to remember. The school itself had to decide how to remember the war, and the hardest question it faced was what to do about the Slytherin dead, because a memorial is a statement about who is mourned and who is not, and the line a memorial draws can wound for generations. When Hogwarts built its memorial to the fallen of the battle, the names of the defenders who died were carved into stone. The brave students and teachers and townspeople who had given their lives holding the castle against the dark, that was simple. They were heroes, and they were honoured as heroes, and no one questioned that they belonged on the stone. The harder question was the others, the Slytherin students who had died, not fighting for the castle, but caught up in the chaos, or fighting on the wrong side, or simply dead in a battle that swept over them before they could choose anything at all. Vincent Crabbe, who died by his own cursed fire, reaching for a magic too dark to control. The young Death Eaters who fell. The frightened children of frightened families, dead in a war their parents had chosen for them. Did their names belong on the memorial too? Were they to be mourned alongside the people who had died, trying to stop the very cause those others had served? It is a genuinely hard question, and the school did not answer it quickly or easily. There were those who said that to honour the Slytherin dead alongside the defenders was an insult to the defenders, that it muddied the clear moral line the memorial was supposed to draw, that a boy who died serving Voldemort had no place carved in the same stone as the people who died stopping him. And there were those who said that a dead 17-year-old is a dead 17-year-old, that the children who died on the losing side were as much victims of the war as anyone, raised into a cause they never chose and killed before they were old enough to escape it, and that to leave their names off the stone was to punish them forever for the crimes of their parents. Both arguments had weight. Both were made by people of good conscience. The question had no clean answer, because the war had no clean shape, however much everyone wished it did. What the school settled on in the end was something more honest than a simple answer. It chose to remember the war truthfully, which meant remembering that it had been a catastrophe that consumed the guilty and the innocent and the merely unlucky altogether, that the dead of the battle included heroes and villains, and a great many children who were neither. The defenders were honoured as defenders, their courage named for what it was. But the school refused, under McGonagall's hand, to pretend that the only deaths that mattered were the ones on the winning side, or to teach its students that a dead Slytherin child was beneath mourning. The grief of the losing families was given at last a small and grudging place in the public memory of the war, not as heroes but as the dead, as people who had been loved and lost. And that small acknowledgement meant more to those families than almost anything else the new world gave them. To be allowed, finally, to mourn in the open, to have it admitted that your dead child was a child and not only an enemy. It was not much, After years of grieving in silence and shame, it was a great deal. Let the history settle for a while now, and let us simply spend a night and a year inside the recovered house, because there is no better way to feel how far it had come than to sit in it through the turning of the seasons, when nothing dramatic is happening at all, and the place is only itself. Begin in autumn, on the first night of a new school year, some years into the long peace. Anne. The lake above the common room is dark and cold, the surface broken by the first chill winds of the season. Though down in the dungeon you would never know it except for the deeper green the water takes on as the light fails earlier each evening. The new first years have arrived. They came across the lake in the little boats in the last of the daylight, saw the castle rise up, lit against the darkening sky, and were sorted under the hat in the great hall. And now the ones in green are being led down for the first time to the place that will be their home for 7 years. They are small and tired and overwhelmed, clutching the new robes that still smell of the shop. The older students welcome them in the green light, show them the dormitories down the stone passages, point out the best chairs by the fire, tell them which staircase to avoid on a Tuesday and where the kitchens are, and how to get a house elf to bring up cocoa on a cold night. The portraits watch from the walls, and the oldest of them, who have seen 1,000 such first nights, murmur to one another that the children look smaller every year, which is what the old always say, and have always said. The fire burns, the lake presses its great dark weight against the windows, and a frightened 11-year-old, far from home for the first time, falls asleep in a bed under the lake and wakes in the morning to discover that the green light is beautiful, and that the house is warm, and that they are, after all, going to be all right. Winter comes, and the dungeon is the warmest place in the whole cold castle, because it is deep underground where the chill of the Scottish winter cannot easily reach, and because the fire is never allowed to go out. Up above, the snow falls on the grounds and the lake freezes at its edges, and the windows of the common room show a strange muffled white light filtering down through the ice, the whole room dim and silvered and still. This is the season the house feels most like a refuge. And the students come in from the freezing corridors, stamping the cold out of their feet, and they cluster around the fire with their books and their homework and their endless talk, and the long winter evenings stretch out warm and golden in the green dark. Anne. Someone is always failing to finish an essay. Someone is always in love with someone who does not know it. Someone is always plotting some small triumph, a way to win the next match, a scheme to get back at a rival, an ambition just slightly too large for their years, because they are Slytherins, and ambition is what they are for. The portraits doze in their frames. The squid drifts past the windows, vast and slow and indifferent on its way to wherever the squid goes, and the snow keeps falling on the world above, and the house keeps the cold out, the way it has for 1,000 winters. Anne. Spring arrives late this far north, and it arrives first as a change in the light through the windows, the green growing brighter and clearer as the ice melts off the lake and the days lengthen. Anne. The students grow restless, as students do in spring, their minds turning from their books to the warmer world they can sense waiting above them. Exams loom. The 5th years and 7th years bend over their work with a new and unwelcome seriousness, and the younger ones torment them by being carefree. The Quidditch season reaches its height, and the green and silver banners come out, and the house pours down to the pitch to scream itself hoarse for its team, and the old rivalry with Gryffindor flares up bright and fierce and, now, mostly friendly. A Slytherin seeker pulls off a catch that the whole house will talk about for years. A match is won or lost by a margin, so thin it will be argued over at the fire for a week. The ordinary epic of school sport plays itself out under the spring sky, and the children who play it have no idea that a generation before, those same matches carried the venom of a society at war with itself. To them, it is only Quidditch, only the bright, fierce joy of a game well played, and that ignorance is itself a kind of victory. The victory of a peace so settled that the children living in it cannot imagine anything else. And then summer, and the end of the year, and the house empties out again. Anne. The students pack their trunks and say their goodbyes. The first years now a year older and no longer frightened. The 7th years leaving for the last time. pausing in the doorway of the common room to look back at the green light one final time before they go out into the world to become whatever their ambition will make of them. Some of them will be healers, some will be ministry officials, shopkeepers, inventors, teachers, parents. A few will be famous, and a great many will not. All of them will carry, somewhere in them, the memory of this room, the green light, the fire, the long winter evenings, the feeling of having belonged to something old and proud that the world had once tried to be ashamed of and had failed. They take the boats back across the lake in the summer evening, and the castle shrinks behind them, and the Hogwarts Express carries them south to London, and the common room under the lake falls silent and empty for the summer, lit by the elves out of old habit, watched by the dozing portraits, waiting through the long warm months for the autumn and the boats, and the next small frightened children who will come down the stone stairs and discover that they are home. The portraits deserve a closer look, because they are the house's memory made visible, and on a quiet night you could learn the whole long story of Slytherin just by listening to them talk among themselves. A wizarding portrait is a strange and limited kind of life. It holds the manner and the memories and something of the personality of the person it was painted from, enough to talk, to advise, to argue, to remember, though it is not the person and knows it is not. The walls of the Slytherin common room hold a long gallery of such portraits, former students and heads of house, and the occasional famous name stretching back through the centuries, each painted in the dress of their age, each carrying the opinions and the prejudices and the wisdom of the time they lived in. On a quiet night when the students are asleep, the portraits talk, and their talk is the conversation of 1,000 years of one house with itself. There are old portraits there, figures in the heavy robes of centuries past, who remember a Slytherin that existed before any of the modern quarrels, who speak of the founder himself as a memory passed down rather than a legend, and who hold the oldest and least poisoned idea of what the house was meant to be. Anne. There are portraits from the dark centuries, men and women, who absorbed the blood purity creed with their mother's milk and never questioned it, who would have approved of much of what Voldemort preached, and who argue, still in their frames, for the old hateful certainties, because a portrait cannot learn what its subject never learned. Anne. And there are portraits from the gentler ages, kind faces who valued the house's ambition without its arrogance, who used their cunning in the service of good ends, and who represent the better tradition that ran through Slytherin all along beneath the darkness that got all the attention. These portraits argue with one another in the long nights, the way a family argues across its generations. The old purist in his heavy black robes scoffs at the changes the house has undergone, but about its standards and bloodlines and the good old days when a Slytherin knew his own worth. The gentler faces argue back, pointed to the heroes the house has produced, remind the purist of how his beloved certainties ended, in a war that nearly destroyed the school and a dark lord who was, himself, the purest expression of everything the purist claims to admire. The oldest portraits, who remember the most, often say the least, having learned across their long-painted centuries that the arguments go in circles and that the house survives all of them. They have watched the house be proud and be ashamed and be proud again. They have watched it produce monsters and heroes and 10,000 ordinary people. Anne. They have watched the world's opinion of it rise and fall and rise, and they know, in the way that only something very old can know, that the current chapter is not the last one, that the house will go on changing long after the present students are themselves only portraits on the wall, arguing with the students of some unimaginable future age. Anne. A student who could not sleep, wandering down to the common room in the small hours, might sit by the dying fire and listen to the portraits murmur, and might learn more about the house from that murmuring than from any history book. They would hear the whole argument of Slytherin laid out by the people who lived it, the purists and the reformers, the proud and the ashamed, the cruel and the kind, all of them Slytherins, all of them claiming the house as their own, none of them able to reduce it to a single thing. Anne. And the student might understand, sitting there in the green dark, that this is what the house actually is. Not the villains the world feared, and not the heroes the house liked to remember, but the whole long argument itself, The 1,000-year conversation between everyone who ever wore the green, still going on in the frames on the wall. Never finished, never resolved, carried forward by each new generation that comes down the stone stairs and adds its own voice to the talk. Anne. The house elves of the old families have their own small place in this, and one of them in particular shows the whole pattern of the war's bitterness, and its healing compressed into a single life. Kreacher had served the ancient and pure-blood House of Black for the whole of his long life, and the family had shaped him into something twisted and bitter, soaked in the same blood purity creed his masters lived by. Loyal to the cruelest of them, and contemptuous of everyone the family taught him to despise. He was not a sympathetic creature in his bad years. He was spiteful and sour and dangerous. His loyalties tangled around a family that had mostly treated him as furniture, and he did real harm in the war, his small betrayals helping the dark along in ways that cost lives. He was, you might say, a victim of the same poison that ran through all the old pure blood houses, a creature raised into hatred by the people who owned him and acting it out because it was all he had ever been taught. What changed him was kindness, and the smallness of the kindness is the point. Harry Potter, who had every reason to despise the bitter old elf, came to understand the grief that lay under Kreacher's spite, the loyalty he had borne to Regulus Black, the one master who had ever shown him a scrap of decency, the master who had died turning against the Dark Lord with only this elf to help him. And Harry, instead of meeting the elf's hatred with his own, met it with a small act of respect. He gave Kreacher something that had belonged to Regulus, treated him as a being with feelings worth considering, spoke to him with a decency the elf had never once received from the family that owned him. And the bitter old creature, who had been twisted by cruelty his whole long life, turned, the way a plant turns toward light, toward the first kindness anyone had ever shown him. He became loyal, devoted, even happy in his last years, transformed not by any grand redemption but by the simple discovery that he could be treated as something more than a thing. There is the whole story again, in the life of one old elf. Cruelty makes cruelty. The poison passes down from master to servant as surely as from father to son, and the creature raised in hatred acts out the hatred it was raised in. Anne. And then a small kindness, offered where no kindness was owed, breaks the pattern, and the twisted thing turns toward the light and becomes something better than its making. What healed Kreacher was exactly what healed the House of Slytherin, only smaller and faster and easier to see. Not punishment, not vengeance. Just the patient, stubborn, unglamorous decision to treat a being shaped by cruelty with a decency it had never earned and could not have expected, until the decency did what cruelty never could, and the bitter thing softened, and the poison stopped passing on. There is a question underneath this whole story that is worth sitting with as the night deepens. The question of how we are supposed to judge people, and the House of Slytherin after the war is as good a place as any to think it through, slowly, with no need to reach an answer before you sleep. The easy way to judge is by category. It costs nothing. Anne. You learn that a person belongs to some group, and you assign them all the qualities you have decided that group has, and you are done, freed from the labor of actually looking at them. The wizarding world judged Slytherin this way for years. Green robes, therefore suspect. The name of a Death Eater family, therefore guilty. It is the laziest kind of judgment and also the most natural, because the human mind loves a shortcut, and a category is the best shortcut there is. The trouble is that it is almost always wrong. Not a little wrong, but badly and consequentially wrong, because people do not actually come in categories. They come one at a time, each of them a whole world, each of them containing far more variety and contradiction than any category could hold. The hard way to judge is by the person. It is expensive. Anne. It requires you to set aside what you think you know about the group and look at the individual in front of you, to weigh what they have actually done rather than what people like them are supposed to do, to hold open the possibility that this particular Slytherin is nothing like the story you have been told about Slytherins. Kingsley Shacklebolt built the entire post-war system of justice on the insistence that this harder kind of judgment was the only legitimate one, that you must judge the deed and not the name, and in doing so, he did more for Slytherin than any defender of the house ever did with a speech. He did not argue that Slytherins were good. Anne. He simply insisted that they be judged as individuals, and when they were judged as individuals, the truth came out, which was that most of them had done nothing wrong at all. The story of the house after the war is at bottom the story of a society slowly and reluctantly learning to judge the harder way. It did not want to. It would have much preferred to keep its simple story, to go on believing that the war had a clean shape, brave houses against the wicked one, and that the wickedness could be safely contained in a single set of colours and a single set of families. Reality kept refusing to cooperate. The wicked house kept producing heroes. The brave houses kept producing cowards and fools. The families that should have been guilty turned out, half of them, to be innocent, and a few of the innocent seeming turned out to be guilty. Every attempt to keep the simple story alive ran aground on the endless, stubborn complexity of actual people, until the society gave up, exhausted, and admitted what it had been trying not to admit, that you cannot know a person from their house, that the green and silver told you nothing about a soul. Anne. That admission was the whole of the recovery, and it was not a comfortable one, because it took away something people wanted. A simple story is a comfort. It tells you who to trust and who to fear. It organizes a frightening world into clear shapes. It lets you feel safe and righteous, without having to do the hard work of looking closely at anyone. Giving up the simple story about Slytherin meant giving up that comfort, accepting instead the harder truth that the world is full of individuals who must each be met on their own terms, that you cannot take a shortcut to knowing a person, that the green-robed child in front of you is a mystery you will have to actually solve rather than a type you can simply file away. Most people, most of the time, would rather not do that work. The achievement of the years after the war was that the wizarding world did it anyway, slowly, grudgingly, one Slytherin at a time, until the doing of it became a habit, and the habit became a peace. Let us follow the threads to their ends now, gently, the way you might trace the lives of people you once knew and lost track of. Because everyone in this story grew old or did not, and there is a quiet in knowing where they all came to rest. Horace Slughorn lived a long and comfortable old age, as such men often do. Surrounded to the last by the famous and the promising, his rooms full of photographs of the students he had collected across a career that spanned generations. Anne. He had come back to fight when it counted, and he had defended his house when it needed defending, and he had earned, by those 2 late acts of courage, a peace that his earlier life of careful self-interest might not have promised him. He died old and well-loved, his Slytherins scattered across the wizarding world in every position of use and honour, his name spoken with affection by people who had been frightened children in green and had found in him an adult who believed in them. It was a good end for a man who had spent most of his life avoiding the very situations that finally redeemed him. Minerva McGonagall held the headmistress's office for many years, stern and fair and unbending to the last, and under her the school did the slow work of healing that no one else could have driven so well. She had defended Slytherin's place in the castle when it would have been easier to let the house wither, and she had done it not out of any love for the house, for she was Gryffindor to her bones, but out of a sense of justice so rigid that it would not bend even for her own preferences. That is the rarest and most valuable kind of fairness, the kind that protects the people you do not even like, and McGonagall had it, and the house owed her a debt it mostly never knew about. When she finally laid down the office, the school she handed on was more whole than the one she had inherited, and the green and silver hung in the Great Hall beside the other 3 colours, as though they had never been in any danger of coming down. Kingsley Shacklebolt served as Minister for Magic for a long stretch of years, and the system of fair trials and individual justice that he built in the chaos after the war hardened, over time, into the settled practice of the new wizarding world. He was not a flashy minister. He did not chase glory or pick dramatic fights. He simply held year after year to the principle that people must be judged for what they do and not for what they are. And by holding to it long enough, he made it ordinary, made it the assumption rather than the exception. And in doing so, he changed the character of his society more lastingly than any number of grander gestures could have. The Dementors never returned to Azkaban in his time. The roundups that the angry had demanded after the war never came. He gave the wizarding world a peace built on justice rather than vengeance, and Slytherin, more than any other house, lived because he did. Anne. Harry Potter grew old as the most famous man in his world, which is its own kind of burden, and he carried it the way he carried everything, with a tired decency that asked for no special credit. Anne. He led the Auras for many years, raised his children, watched his youngest son wear green and love a Malfoy and turn out fine, and made, across his long life, 1,000 small choices that all pointed the same way, toward fairness, toward mercy, toward the refusal to hate a person for the company history had assigned them. His testimony at the trials, his words to his frightened son on the platform, his insistence that Snape be honored as a hero, all of it added up to a single sustained argument, made not in speeches but in actions, that the war was over and the hating could stop. No one did more to redeem Slytherin in the public mind than the one person with the most reason to despise it, and he did it without ever quite seeming to try, simply by being unable, in the end, to hate the way the simple story wanted him to. And the children, the ones who carried the story forward. Scorpius Malfoy grew up out of his lonely, rumor-haunted boyhood into a young man as kind as he had been as a child, the gentleness surviving everything the world had thrown at it, and he became living proof that the chain his father had broken stayed broken. Albus Potter grew up too, out of his fear of green and his fear of failing his famous father, into someone who had learned that the house you are sorted into is the beginning of a story and not the end of one. The two of them, the Potter and the Malfoy, remained friends, and their friendship outlasted all the old enmity that their surnames had once carried. And when they were grown men with children of their own, the war that had set their families against each other was, to their children, a thing in a history book, as distant and strange as any old war is to the young. The threads that began on opposite sides of a battlefield ended braided together, in a friendship between two boys who refused the story they had been handed, and chose, instead, each other. It is late now, in our long night together, and it seems right to spend some of these small hours where the house spends them, in the deep middle of the night, when the whole castle sleeps, and the dungeon is at its stillest, and there is nothing to do but rest. Picture the common room at 3 a.m, years into the piece. The fire has burned down to embers, a low red glow that throws almost no light, so that the room is lit mostly by the lake, that shifting underwater green, coming faint through the windows from a moon somewhere far above the surface. The chairs sit empty, a book lies open and face down where some student left it, meaning to come back. The portraits have gone quiet at last, their subjects dozing or simply still, the long night argument suspended until tomorrow. The dormitory doors are shut, and behind them the students sleep, a few dozen ambitious children, dreaming whatever ambitious children dream, safe under the weight of the lake, warm in the deep stone heart of the castle. The lake itself is the great slow presence over everything, and it is worth thinking about in the small hours, the sheer patient mass of it pressing against the windows. It was there before the school. It will be there after. The mer people move through its depths on their own errands. The giant squid drifts through the cold dark water, and far below, in places no student ever sees, the lake keeps its own ancient life entirely indifferent to the school that perches on its shore. The windows of the Slytherin common room look out into that indifference, into the green deep where the human world does not reach, and there is a strange comfort in it, the comfort of being a small warm room held inside something vast and old and uncaring. The troubles of the house, the war, and the suspicion and the long recovery are nothing to the lake. Anne, the lake has watched 1,000 years of students come and go, and has not noticed any of them. Whatever weighed on you when you lay down to sleep, the lake does not care, and there is a peace in that, the peace of being briefly unimportant, of resting inside something so much larger than your own concerns that the concerns themselves go quiet. The castle above sleeps in its hundreds of rooms, the moving staircases finally still, the suits of armor silent in their alcoves, the ghosts drifting through the dark on their endless rounds, the only ones awake. A ghost might pass through the dungeons in these hours, the bloody baron perhaps, the grim spectre of Slytherin House, gliding silver and silent through the stone, trailing his old griefs behind him. The ghosts remember everything and forget nothing, which is their particular curse. And the baron has haunted these dungeons for 1,000 years, has watched every chapter of the house's long story. The proud centuries and the dark ones and the slow recovery after the war, he says, little Anne. He has seen too much to be surprised by anything, and he moves through the sleeping house like a memory the house cannot quite put down, a reminder that the place is older and stranger than any of its living students can imagine. By morning he will be gone again to wherever the ghosts go, and the students will wake and never know he passed through, and the ordinary day will begin, and the deep night, with all its stillness and its presences, will fold itself away until the next time the world goes dark. And somewhere in one of those dormitories, a student lies awake. There is always one. A child who cannot sleep, kept up by worry or excitement, or the simple restless mind that will not switch off, lying in the dark under the lake, listening to the breathing of the others and the faint sounds of the water beyond the walls. Once, in the years right after the war, that wakeful child might have been kept up by fear, by the knowledge that the world outside thought their house was wicked, that they would have to walk out into the corridors tomorrow, carrying a name that made people flinch. A generation later, the wakeful child is kept up by ordinary things, an exam, a quarrel with a friend, a first and hopeless love, the ordinary sleeplessness of the young, untroubled by any larger fear about who they are or what their colours mean. That change, from the child kept awake by the weight of the house's shame, to the child kept awake by nothing worse than algebra and longing, is the whole of the recovery written small. In a single dark dormitory, in a single sleepless head finally free to worry about nothing more than the things every young person everywhere has always lain awake worrying about. Anne. Think of where all those green-robed children went when they left the boats and the lake behind and walked out into the world. Because the recovery of the house was written, in the end, in the ordinary working lives of thousands of people the legend never names. Somewhere in St. Mungo's hospital, on a long night shift, a healer who had been a Slytherin bends over a patient that the other healers had given up on. Anne. She is good at this in a way that has everything to do with the house that shaped her. She is ambitious, relentless, unwilling to accept the verdict that nothing more can be done, and she is cunning enough to see the angle the others missed, the unorthodox treatment, the clever indirect approach to a problem that resisted the obvious one. Anne. She has spent her whole career being slightly distrusted by colleagues who remembered what her house was supposed to mean, and she has answered that distrust the only way that ever works, by being undeniably excellent, by saving lives that no one else could save, until the question of her house simply stopped coming up, because the question of her skill had settled it. The patient lives. Anne. The healer goes home in the grey morning, tired and satisfied, a Slytherin who used everything the house gave her, the ambition and the cunning and the refusal to quit, to do nothing but good. The legend has no place for her. She is too ordinary, too useful, too plainly admirable to fit the story of the wicked house. And there were thousands like her. In the Ministry of Magic, a mid-level official who had been a Slytherin works late on a piece of policy reform, the dull and necessary work of making a society function. He is clever in the way the house teaches, able to see how the pieces fit, how to move an idea through the machinery of committees and rivals and entrenched interests, how to get a good thing done in a system designed to prevent anything from getting done at all. He learned politics in the Slytherin common room, in the small intrigues and alliances of a house full of ambitious children, and he uses what he learned not to grab power for himself, but to push through a reform that will help people who will never know his name. That is ambition in its useful form, the engine turned toward building rather than dominating, and the house had always produced as much of it as it produced the other kind. The reform passes. The official goes home, unthanked, having improved his world by a small increment through the patient exercise of exactly the skills his house had been slandered for. There were thousands like him too. A Slytherin runs a shop in Diagon Alley, honest and shrewd, building a good business through hard work and cleverness, and a sharp eye for what people need. Anne. Another teaches, having found in the classroom the place where their ambition and their love of cleverness could be poured into the next generation. One more invents something, drives some new spell or device into being through the sheer relentless determination the house prizes. Yet another is simply a good parent, raising children with all the fierce protective ambition of someone who wants, more than anything, for their child to have a better life than they did. And one works as an auror, a dark wizard catcher, and is very good at it. Because catching dark wizards takes someone who can think the way they think, who can see the angle and the deception and the hidden move, and a Slytherin, trained in exactly that kind of seeing, makes a formidable hunter of the very people the house was once accused of producing. And there is a justice in it that the early years after the war could never have imagined. A Slytherin spending their career protecting the world from the kind of person the world had assumed every Slytherin would become. The house spread out into the world in 10,000 directions, and most of those directions led nowhere dramatic, only to the ordinary, useful, good lives of ordinary, useful people. And that ordinariness, multiplied across a generation, was what finally killed the legend of the wicked house. Anne, you cannot sustain the belief that a house is evil while its graduates are healing your sick and teaching your children and running your shops and inventing your conveniences. Reality wears the legend down. It always does, given enough time and enough ordinary lives. Anne, the children of the wizarding world grew up, in time, hearing a different bedtime story about Slytherin than their grandparents had told. The old story had been a warning, the house of the dark wizards, the place the bad ones came from, a thing to frighten a child away from a certain kind of ambition. The new story, the one the recovery made possible, was more interesting and more true. It was the story of a house that had carried a 1,000-year burden, that had produced the worst wizard who ever lived, and also some of the bravest, that had been wronged and had endured the wrong, and had come back to itself, that taught its children to be ambitious and cunning and determined, and that those things were gifts rather than sins. A child hearing that story might decide that being sorted into Slytherin would be a fine thing, an inheritance worth having, and that decision, multiplied across enough children, across enough years, was the surest sign that the house had survived not just in its stones, but in the imagination of the world, which is the only place a house truly lives or dies. There is a thread running through this whole story that is worth holding. As the night winds down, the question of inheritance, of what gets passed from one generation to the next, and what can be set down and refused. Every child inherits more than they choose. They inherit a name, a family, a set of beliefs poured into them before they were old enough to question any of it, a place in the world they did not ask for. Draco Malfoy inherited the blood purity creed the way a child inherits an accent, absorbed it so young and so completely that it felt like simple fact rather than a choice. The Slytherin children of the years after the war inherited a tainted name, a reputation built before they were born, a suspicion they had done nothing to earn. None of them chose what was handed to them. That is the first hard truth about inheritance, that it arrives without consent, that you wake up one day already carrying things you never agreed to carry. But there is a second truth, and the whole recovery of the house turns on it, which is that what you inherit is not the same as what you pass on. Between receiving and giving there is a space, narrow and difficult and real, in which a person can decide. Draco received the poison and chose not to pass it on. He could not undo what had been put into him, could not erase the years of his own indoctrination, or the mark on his arm, or the things he had done while he still believed. What he could do, the only thing any of us can do with a bad inheritance, was refuse to hand it forward. He raised a son free of the thing that had nearly destroyed his own life. The creed that had been poured into Draco stopped with Draco. It did not reach Scorpius. The chain, which had run unbroken through the Malfoy line for generations, each father handing the poison to each son, broke in a single generation because one damaged man decided that it would break, and spent his life making sure it did. The house did the same thing on a larger scale. Slytherin inherited 1,000 years of accumulated meaning, the founder's prejudice and the dark wizards, and the whispered association with everything the world feared. It could not erase that inheritance. The Chamber of Secrets had been real, Voldemort had been real, had worn the green, had been the truest heir of Salazar's worst self. The house could not pretend otherwise, and to its credit it never really tried. What it could do was choose what to pass forward. It could hand its children the ambition without the arrogance, the cunning without the cruelty, the pride without the prejudice, Anne. It could teach the next generation that the serpent meant wisdom and renewal rather than venom, that the house's gifts were gifts, that the worst of its history was a warning rather than a model. Anne. The house received a poisoned inheritance and spent the years after the war deciding, deliberately and against the weight of 1,000 years, what part of that inheritance it would actually pass on. That deciding was the work, that deciding was the recovery. This is the quiet hope buried under the whole long story, and it is worth carrying with you into sleep, because it is true far beyond the walls of any school. We do not choose what we are given. We are all of us handed things by the people who came before us, the good and the bad mixed together, past any easy separating, the love and the wounds and the beliefs and the wounds again, poured into us before we could refuse. But we are not only the sum of what we were given. There is that narrow space between receiving and passing on, and in that space a person is free, genuinely free, to decide what they will carry forward and what they will let die with them. The cruelty can stop, the poison can stop. A chain that has run unbroken for generations can break in a single life, if someone decides to break it and is willing to do the long hard work of breaking it. Draco Malfoy was not a hero. He was a flawed and damaged man who had done real wrong, and he broke the chain, and the kindness of his son is real in the world because he did, and that is a thing worth knowing as you lie in the dark, that whatever was handed to you, you get to decide what you hand on. The written record of the house changed too, slowly, across the decades, and the change in the books was its own quiet measure of how far the recovery had come. In the first years after the war, what got written about Slytherin was mostly accusation dressed as history. Anne. The accounts of the battle and its aftermath, rushed into print while the wounds were still open, treated the house as a settled villain, the place the dark had come from, and they reached for the simple shape that frightened and grieving readers wanted. Slytherin was the warning in those books, the cautionary example, the house, whose very existence proved that some kinds of ambition led only to ruin. A child reading one of those early histories would close it, believing that to be sorted into green was very nearly a moral failing in itself. And that belief, printed and reprinted, hardened into the conventional wisdom of the age. Anne. It took a long time for better books to be written, because honest history is slow and the honest historians had to wait for the heat to die down before anyone would listen to them. But they came in time. Anne. A careful chronicler who actually read the trial records rather than the rumours, and found that the great mass of Slytherins had been guilty of nothing. A historian who tracked down the real story of Severus Snape and laid out, in patient detail, the 20 years of hidden courage that the early accounts had missed entirely. A scholar who went back to the founding and reconstructed what Salazar Slytherin had actually valued, separating the man's prejudice from the house's gifts, showing that the two had been tangled together by 1,000 years of frightened storytelling rather than by any necessity. These books did not sell the way the early accusations had sold. Honest history rarely does, but they accumulated on the shelves, year by year, a growing body of careful truth sitting beside the early lies, and the children of later generations grew up able to find the true account if they went looking for it. Even Hogwarts, a history, the great standing record of the school that every student knew of and few actually read, came in time to tell a fuller story of the house, one that held the darkness and the light together, that named Voldemort as the house's worst son and Snape as one of its bravest, and let the contradiction stand because the contradiction was true. To read the entry on Slytherin in a late edition of that book was to read something far more honest than the early histories had managed, a real account of a real house, ancient and flawed and gifted and resilient, that had produced the worst of the age and survived the producing. The record had caught up at last with the reality. The books had stopped accusing and started understanding, and a house that lives as much in the written word as in its stones was, by that change, more fully redeemed than any single living act could have managed. Look forward now, past the lives we have followed, into the long stretch of years that the house will go on existing through after everyone in this story is gone, because a 1,000-year-old thing measures time differently than the people who pass through it, and there is a deep calm in taking the long view. The war that nearly ended the wizarding world will not always be remembered the way it was remembered in the years right after it. Already, by the third generation, it had faded from a fresh wound into history. Give it another 100 years and it will fade further into the kind of distant founding event that a culture half remembers and half mythologizes. The names worn smooth by retelling, the details simplified, the whole terrible reality of it, compressed into a few lines in a textbook, and a memorial that students walk past without reading. Voldemort will become a figure as distant and storybook as the dark wizards of earlier centuries, a name to frighten children with, robbed by time of the raw terror he held for the people who actually lived through him. And Slytherin's long disgrace after the war, the suspicion and the slander and the slow recovery will fade right along with it until some future student in green, sitting by the same fire under the same lake, will find it almost impossible to believe that there was ever a time when their house was treated as a thing to be ashamed of. That future student will inherit a Slytherin that has been, for centuries by then, simply one of the four houses, no better and no worse than the others, the house of the ambitious and the cunning, an honoured stream of the school's life. Anne. They will know, if they study the history, that their house once produced the darkest wizard of an age, and was punished for it long after the punishment had ceased to be fair. But they will know it the way we know about distant wars, as information rather than as feeling, and the knowing will not weigh on them. Anne. They will wear their green without a second thought. They will scheme their small school schemes and chase their large ambitions, and fall in and out of love and grow up. And the great recovery that cost so much and took so long will have become, for them, simply the ordinary condition of the world, the water they swim in, invisible because it is everywhere. Anne. That is what the people who did the work of the recovery were really working for. Though they could not have known it and would not have lived to see it, they were not working to be thanked. Anne. McGonagall defending the house, Slughorn welcoming the frightened first years, Kingsley insisting on fair trials, Harry speaking the truth about Snape, Draco breaking the chain, the thousands of ordinary Slytherins living their good ordinary lives. None of them were doing it for the gratitude of a future they would never see. Anne. They were doing it because it was right, in the moment, for the people in front of them, and the accumulated weight of all those right choices, made by people who mostly never knew one another, added up across the years to a gift handed forward to children not yet born, the gift of a house they could belong to without shame. The future student in green will never know the names of the people who gave them that. They will simply live inside the gift, untroubled. The way we live inside 1,000 gifts handed to us by people whose names we never learned. That anonymity is not a tragedy. It is the ordinary shape of how a better world gets built, by people who will not be there to enjoy it, for people who will never know to thank them. And the lake will go on, and the fire will go on being lit, and the green light will go on moving across the stone, and the boats will go on, carrying the small frightened children across the water each autumn to discover that the castle is home. The house will outlast the war, outlast the recovery, outlast the very memory of why it ever needed recovering. It will be there, under the lake, in the deep heart of the castle, long after every name in this story has faded, holding its place among the four houses, nurturing its ambitious children, shedding its skin and renewing itself age after age, the serpent on its crest meaning, as it always should have meant, wisdom and watchfulness, and the patient capacity to become something new. The night is almost over now, ours and the castle's both, and there is a particular stillness in the last dark hour before dawn that is the gentlest part of the whole turning of the day, so let us rest there for a while. In that last hour, the lake above the dungeon begins very slowly to change. The deep black of the deepest night gives way by the smallest degrees to a darkness with a hint of colour in it, the first far-off promise of the sun somewhere below the horizon, and the green light through the common room windows shifts from near black to a deep, dim, underwater jade. Nothing moves in the room. The embers have gone cold and grey in the hearth. The book still lies face down where it was left. The portraits sleep on in their frames, the old purist and the gentle reformer, and the ancient faces who remember the founders, all of them still, their long argument resting until the day calls it up again. The students sleep behind their doors, deep in the heaviest sleep of the night, the sleep that comes in the hour before waking, and even the restless one, who lay awake so long, has drifted off at last, carried under by the sheer weight of the late hour. Far above, on the surface of the lake, the water lies flat and calm in the windless dark before dawn, and the great castle stands over it, its hundreds of windows dark, its towers black against a sky that is just beginning to think about turning grey in the east. The grounds are silent. The forbidden forest is a deeper black at the edge of the dark lawns, its own nightlife, settling toward rest as the nocturnal creatures finish their hunting, and the day creatures have not yet stirred. The greenhouses sit quiet. The Quidditch pitch is empty, the hoops standing tall and still against the lightening sky. The whole vast, complicated machine of the school, the moving stairs and the talking portraits, and the hundreds of sleeping children and the ghosts on their endless rounds, has wound down to its lowest and stillest point, the deep trough of the night, the moment of most complete rest before the long, slow climb back up into day. Anne. This is the hour when the castle most belongs to itself, when there is no one awake to need anything from it, when it is simply an ancient building full of sleeping people standing over a dark lake in the last of the night. It has stood through 1,000 such hours, 1,000 times 1,000, the deep still dark before 10,000 dawns. It stood through them before the war, and during the war, and after, and the hour before dawn has always felt the same, regardless of what the daylight hours held, a deep universal stillness that the troubles of any particular age cannot reach. The war could not touch this hour. The recovery did not change it. The deep, still dark before the dawn is older than all of it. The same now as it was 1,000 years ago, when the founders first raised the castle and slept their first night inside it. The same as it will be 1,000 years from now, when everyone alive today is long forgotten. There is a great peace in that, in the thought of an hour so deep and so old that nothing that happens in the daylight can disturb it. An hour that simply holds the sleeping world in the dark and waits, patient and unhurried, for the light. And then, by degrees too slow to watch, the change comes. The sky in the east begins to grey. The black of the lake softens. The green light in the dungeon windows lifts, almost imperceptibly, toward the brighter jade of early morning. Somewhere up in the castle a portrait stirs. A house elf begins the day's first work in the kitchens far below. The deep trough of the night is past, and the slow climb back toward day has begun, and the sleeping students, though they do not know it, are an hour closer to waking. But that is for later. For now, there is still the dark, still the stillness, still the deep green peace under the lake, and there is no need to rise yet, no need to do anything at all except rest in the last of the night and let the world climb back toward morning without you. Anne. Before we let the story go, there is one last thing worth turning over slowly in the quiet, which is the difference between forgetting and healing, because they look alike from a distance, and they are not the same thing at all. And the House of Slytherin found the second rather than the first. A wound can disappear two ways. It can be forgotten, papered over, the painful thing simply pushed out of memory until no one speaks of it anymore, and the silence is mistaken for peace. Or it can heal, which is slower and harder and means something entirely different. To forget is to lose the memory. To heal is to keep the memory and lose the pain. To be able to look at the old wound clearly, to know exactly what happened and how much it cost, and to find that looking at it no longer hurts the way it did. The wizarding world did not forget the war. Anne, it could not have, and it should not have, because the dead deserved remembering, and the lesson deserved keeping. What it did, slowly and at great cost, was heal. It learned to hold the memory of the war, including the memory of how it had wronged Slytherin afterward, without that memory poisoning the present. The history stayed, the pain faded. That is healing, and it is rarer and more valuable than the forgetting that so often passes for it. The house healed the same way. It did not get to forget that it had produced Voldemort, that the Chamber of Secrets had been real, that some of its sons and daughters had been genuine monsters. That memory stayed, woven permanently into what it meant to wear the green. But the house learned to hold that memory without being crushed by it, to know the full dark truth of its own history and still stand up straight, still welcome its children, still take pride in its real virtues. a student in green a generation after the war could say, "Yes, my house produced the darkest wizard of the age, and also my house produced the bravest man the war's greatest hero ever knew," and hold both of those truths at once without flinching from either. That is what a healed wound feels like from the inside. Not the absence of the memory, but the presence of the memory, without the old unbearable weight of it. Anne. The house remembered everything and was no longer destroyed by the remembering. It had found the thing that grief and shame and guilt all eventually offer to anyone patient enough to wait for it, which is not forgetting and is not forgiveness exactly, but simply the slow return of the ability to carry the past without being broken by it. There is a tenderness in how that healing actually happened, person by person, that the grand version of the story misses. It happened in 1,000 small kindnesses that no one recorded. A teacher who treated a Slytherin child fairly when it would have been easier not to. A Gryffindor who befriended a Slytherin against the expectations of both their houses. A shopkeeper who decided one day to stop holding a customer's house against them. A parent who chose not to teach their child the old prejudice. A Slytherin who answered suspicion with excellence instead of bitterness, over and over, for years until the suspicion wore away. None of these were dramatic. None of them made the history books. Each of them was a single small choice by a single ordinary person to treat the people in front of them a little better than the simple story said they had to. And those small choices, uncounted and unremembered, were the actual substance of the recovery, the thing that the grand names and the famous moments only sat on top of. The house was healed by kindness, mostly anonymous, mostly unrewarded, accumulated patiently across a generation until it added up to a changed world. That is perhaps the gentlest truth to carry with you out of this long night, that the great healings of the world are made of small kindnesses, that the recovery of a 1,000-year-old house from the deepest disgrace it ever suffered was built, in the end, out of ordinary people choosing, in ordinary moments, to be a little kinder than they had to be. There was no single hero of Slytherin's recovery. There was no one great act that turned it around. There was only the slow accumulation of deceit, choice by choice, person by person, year by year, until one day the house woke up and found that the weight had lifted, that the green light was beautiful again, that a child could wear the serpent without shame. Kindness is slow. It almost never looks like enough in the moment to fix anything. And it is, in the end, the only thing that ever has. We have come almost to the end of our night together. The story told, the house followed, from the morning after the battle, all the way out into the long peace and the centuries beyond. Before I let my voice soften towards silence and leave you to your rest, let me say one last small thing. If these long, quiet histories are a comfort to you on the nights when sleep is hard to find, the kindest thing you can do, whenever you happen to be awake enough to do it, is to subscribe and stay with us, so that the next time you cannot sleep there is another story already waiting in the dark for you. There is no hurry. You will not forget, and if you do, it does not matter. The stories will keep coming, night after night, for as long as there are tired souls who need a calm voice and a long tale to carry them under. That is all. You can let it go now. Let us bring the night gently down. So picture it one final time, and let the picture grow soft at the edges as you drift. The castle stands over the dark lake in the last of the night. Deep beneath it, under the weight of all that still water, the Slytherin common room rests in its green and silent peace, the fire low, the portraits sleeping, the children safe in their beds. The serpent on the crest above the cold hearth keeps its old patient watch, meaning, as it was always meant to mean, wisdom and renewal rather than fear. The house has carried its 1,000-year burden and set down the worst of it. It has been wronged and has survived the wrong. It has produced the darkest of wizards and some of the bravest of souls, and it has learned at long last to hold both without breaking. And tonight, in the deep green dark, none of that weighs on it at all. Anne. Tonight there is only the stillness, and the lake, and the children sleeping, and the slow approach of a dawn that no one needs to wake for yet. Let your attention loosen now, the way a hand loosens its grip when sleep finally comes, and let the details of the story settle wherever they want to settle. You do not need to hold on to any of it. The names can blur. The Malfoys and the Greengrasses, Slughorn and McGonagall and Kingsley, the boy who lowered his wand on the tower and the gentle sun he raised, the bravest man hidden inside the coldest one, the platform and the nod, and the two lonely boys who found each other on a train. Let them all drift together into the soft middle distance of a story half heard on the edge of sleep, which is the best place for a story to live. You will keep what matters without trying. The rest can go. Think, if you think of anything as you fade, of the green light, that slow shifting underwater green that fills the common room from the depths of the lake, the gentlest light in all the castle. Neither the harsh white of day nor the black of true night, but something in between, a dim and living glow that moves and breathes with the water above it. Generations of children have fallen asleep in that light, washed over the cruel ones and the kind ones alike, over the future Death Eaters and the future healers, over Snape as a lonely boy and Draco as a frightened one, and Scorpius as a gentle one, the same green light, indifferent and calm, soothing them all into sleep across 1,000 years. There is something in that light that does not judge. It simply holds the room in its soul and lets whoever is there rest. And tonight, it can hold you too, wherever you are lying. The green light of a room under a lake that has watched 1,000 years of sleepers and asked nothing of any of them except that they rest. The lake moves above, slow and vast and patient. The fire settles lower in the grate. Somewhere a portrait shifts in its frame and goes still again. The breathing of the sleeping children is the only sound, soft and even, rising and falling in the green dark, and your own breathing can fall into the same slow rhythm if you let it. The long, easy breath of a body giving itself over to sleep. There is nothing left to do tonight. The story is told. The house is at peace. The war is 1,000 years gone, or 19 years gone, or as far gone as you need it to be. And none of it can reach into this quiet room under the water where the green light moves and the fire glows low and the night holds everything gently in the dark. If your mind wanders, let it wander toward easy things. The boats crossing the calm lake in the last light of an autumn evening. The snow falling unseen on the frozen surface far above a warm room. The slow drift of the great squid past a dark window. A book left open on a chair. The deep stillness of the hour before dawn, when even the ghosts have settled, and the whole castle rests at the bottom of the night. These are small and quiet pictures, and they ask nothing of you, and you can let them rise and fade as they please, while your breathing slows, and your body grows heavy and warm, and the waking world loosens its hold. Anne, you have stayed with this long story all the way to its end, through the morning after the battle, and the trials, and the families, and the slow, long healing, through the seasons turning in the dungeon, and the portraits arguing in the dark, and the children sleeping under the lake, all the way to this last soft hour with the green light moving on the stone. There is nothing more to follow now. The threads are all tied off. Everyone in the story has come to rest. The heroes and the villains and the great quiet middle, all of them sorted at last into the places that time assigns to everyone. And the house goes on without them, patient and green and renewed, as it always has and always will. So rest, let the green light hold you, let the lake move slow above you, let the story drift away into the dark where stories go, and let yourself follow it down into sleep, easy and unhurried, with nothing left to carry and nowhere you need to be. The house is at peace, the night is deep and kind, and you can let go now, all the way, down into the quiet, where the green light moves and the water is calm and there is nothing at all but rest, and rest, and rest. Sleep well, the story will keep, and the green light will be here, moving softly on the stone, whenever you need it again.